Hey everyone, tonight we're descending into the marble corridors and echoing chambers of ancient Rome, a place where power was absolute and reason was often the first casualty, a world where emperors ruled not just over legions and laws, but over the fragile balance between sanity and delusion. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel grow. And as always, let me know down in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far this little midnight history circle reaches across the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on that fan or white noise machine for a soft, steady hum in the background. Let your breathing slow down a little, because tonight we're traveling back, not to the bright marble of Roman glory, but to its darker reflection. To the emperors who built palaces of fear, who crowned themselves as gods, who lost their minds beneath golden ceilings and endless praise. It's a story that moves slowly, like the turning of ancient gears from calm to decay, from order to delusion. So let's take our first quiet step together. Rome at dawn was a place of light and silence. The city stretched outward like a sleeping animal, its marble surfaces gathering the first pale rays of morning. The Tiber moved quietly beneath its bridges, glinting with a color that was neither gold nor silver but something between, a reflection of the empire itself, both glorious and uncertain. Smoke from early hearths drifted in soft ribbons over rooftops, and the sound of sandals on stone began to echo faintly through the narrow streets. It was a city at the height of its dominion, and yet even in its stillness there was something uneasy in the air, a weight that hung beneath the calm. The Roman Empire, by the 1st century of its reign, had become a world unto itself. From the misty forests of Germania to the sunburned deserts of Egypt, its roads reached outward like veins from the heart of civilization. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was both a triumph and a fiction. Legions stood like sentinels across the known world, their discipline a quiet guarantee of order, but peace enforced by the sword has always been an illusion of stability. Behind the triumphal arches and the polished statues, behind the legal codes and temples, the system that held this vast machine together was built on conquest, fear, and an unending hunger for control. The city itself embodied that contradiction. The Forum Roman, where senators debated and emperors were praised, was a space of dazzling stone and invisible tension. The marble columns gleamed white under the rising sun, their bases worn smooth by the steps of thousands who had come to watch the rituals of empire. Around the Forum, the voices of orators rose in practiced calm, speaking of law, virtue and destiny. But beyond the outer walls, in the dense dark alleys of the Suburra, the true pulse of Rome beat in another rhythm entirely. There in cramped tenements and crowded taverns lived the multitude who sustained the empire with their labor but shared little in its glory. For centuries the Republic had been ruled by men who claimed to serve the state, consuls, tribunes, and senators whose power was balanced, however uneasily, by custom and law. But that structure had long since been hollowed out. When Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, took the title Princeps, the first citizen, in 27 BCE, it seemed at first like a restoration of order after decades of civil war. In truth, it was the beginning of something else entirely. Rome had found its master, though it would take generations to understand what that truly meant. By the time of Augustus's death in 14 CE, the empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the moors of Britain to the sands of North Africa. Roads, aqueducts, and monuments rose everywhere, tangible symbols of Roman perfection. The people were told that the gods favored this peace, that their emperor was the chosen guardian of harmony and law. In the marble temples of Jupiter and Mars Ultor, priests performed their rituals with unbroken precision. Yet beneath that serenity was a deep current of anxiety, for Rome's peace was bought not with harmony, but with obedience. The empire's greatness was visible in its infrastructure, but its fragility lay in its human heart. Every province, every legion, every senator depended on the figure at the center, the emperor. His image was everywhere, stamped on coins, carved into stone, paraded in festivals. The emperor's face was the face of Rome itself, and so the stability of the entire empire became tied not to systems or laws, but to the temperament of one man. When that man was wise, the empire flourished. When he was not, the empire trembled. From the Palatine Hill, the imperial residence looked down upon the city like a god's eye. Gardens, fountains, and courtyards spread across the hilltop in tranquil order. Statues of divine ancestors lined the walkways, reminders of both legacy and expectation. Servants moved silently through halls decorated with frescoes of myth and conquest, scenes that blurred the line between mortal ruler and immortal deity. The emperor's world was one of ceremony and isolation. He was seen daily by thousands and known by none. It was in this environment, one of splendor and solitude, that the slow corrosion of sanity began to take root. The empire was too vast, its burdens too great, and the man at its center too alone. Every whisper was suspect, every smile potentially deceitful. The Senate, once a body of equals, had become a chamber of caution. Words were measured not for truth, but for survival. A misplaced phrase could end a career, or a life. In such an atmosphere, power became a kind of madness in itself, a quiet, consuming force that reshaped those who held it. Rome's marble, polished and flawless on the surface, concealed cracks beneath its gleam. Even as the legions expanded the empire's borders and merchants brought wealth from the provinces, there was an unspoken recognition that something vital had changed. The Republic's ideals of civic virtue and restraint had faded into memory, replaced by a new kind of rule, one centered on the emperor's will. As dawn gave way to day, the streets filled with movement. Senators in white togas made their way toward the Curia. Merchants opened their stalls along the Via Sacra. Priests tended the eternal flame of Vesta. The rhythm of empire continued, steady and familiar. Yet beneath that routine, the machinery of control turned quietly. Spies reported whispers to imperial agents. Statues of the emperor were inspected for damage or defacement. A crack in a marble cheek could be interpreted as an omen. The ordinary citizens of Rome seldom saw the emperor himself. They saw his image, idealized, serene, godlike, but the man behind it was hidden. To most, he was less a ruler than an idea, the embodiment of stability, prosperity, divine favor. It was a comforting illusion, one that allowed the empire to endure, but illusions demand maintenance. And each emperor who followed Augustus would inherit not only the throne but the weight of that expectation to appear flawless, to command devotion, to bear the loneliness of divinity. By the time the sun stood high above the city, the marble that glowed softly at dawn had turned blindingly bright. Rome shimmered under the heat, its grandeur almost too perfect, too still. The empire seemed eternal, but even eternity can decay from within. Beneath the calm stone of its monuments, the roots of corruption and fear were already spreading, invisible yet unstoppable, as certain as the slow erosion of marble itself. And so within this stillness, within the illusion of harmony, the seeds of Rome's future madness had already taken hold. The emperor's crown, heavy with laurel and gold, would soon reveal its hidden thorns, the burden that would drive some of Rome's rulers from reason into shadow, from control into delusion. The sun moved westward over the Palatine, casting long shadows over the temples and statues. The air thickened with the hum of daily life, and within those shadows, unseen and unacknowledged, the quiet truth of empire began to whisper that the peace of Rome was never truly peace at all. As the sun began to lower across the Roman sky, the marble that had glowed so brightly at noon dulled into shades of soft gold and shadow. The sound of the city, carts creaking over stones, merchants calling out in the markets, fountains murmuring in the courtyards, began to fade into a kind of distant hum. From the Palatine Hill, the heart of imperial power, the city stretched out like a living tapestry, magnificent yet strangely impersonal. From this vantage point, one could see everything except perhaps the truth of what that power did to those who held it. The emperor stood at the center of this vast mechanism, both master and prisoner. The laurel wreath that crowned him was a symbol of victory and divine favor, but beneath it lay a constant pressure, a weight that was not merely political but spiritual. The emperors of Rome were worshipped as living gods, but divinity in a mortal body is a dangerous illusion. It promises serenity and purpose, yet delivers isolation and fear. The Palatine Palace, that grand labyrinth of frescoed halls and shaded gardens, was both sanctuary and cage. Within its walls, the emperor was surrounded by beauty, the cool gleam of marble floors, the rhythmic splash of fountains, the scent of cypress and myrrh carried through open colonnades. Every object was designed to reflect control, proportion, and eternal order. Yet behind this symmetry was a silence that could drive a mind toward despair. The emperor was never truly alone, yet rarely in company. Servants moved like shadows, attendants bowed and withdrew, senators flattered and waited. Every conversation was layered with calculation. Every expression, every pause, every gesture could carry hidden meaning. The burden of absolute power is not the ability to act freely, but the impossibility of trust. From the moment Augustus had created the Principate, a monarchy disguised as a republic, the emperor's life had been one of constant performance. Each word was measured, each appearance choreographed. The emperor's image was the empire's stability. To falter was to endanger not just himself but the illusion of Rome's eternal order. Augustus himself understood this burden with a clarity that bordered on obsession. He had survived civil wars, purged his rivals, and rebuilt the state in his image. Yet even he, the master of moderation, lived behind layers of ritual and secrecy. He appointed guards not merely for protection but for surveillance, ensuring that those closest to him remained under quiet control. His nights were said to be restless, filled with the echoes of the past, the names of those who had fallen so he might reign. To the people he was the princeps, the calm father of Rome, but within the imperial household, he was a man who carried the knowledge that stability could collapse in a single breath. For the emperors who followed, this knowledge became both inheritance and curse. Power magnified not only their authority, but their inner fears. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, was a capable general and administrator, yet he lacked his predecessor's talent for public grace. In the early years of his rule, he performed his duties with precision, but as time passed, the walls of the Palatine grew too close. He began to see treachery in every corner, deceit in every smile. The grandeur of Rome offered him no comfort, its rituals no peace. Eventually he retreated entirely, withdrawing to the island of Capri, where the silence of the sea replaced the noise of the city. Isolation is seductive because it promises safety. For Tiberius, it meant distance from conspirators, from sycophants, from the suffocating expectations of the capital. But isolation also distorts perception. Removed from the rhythms of ordinary life, the emperor began to rely on letters, reports, and whispers. Information filtered through the ambitions of those who stood between him and the truth. Each decision, each execution was a step deeper into solitude. What began as withdrawal became exile from his own humanity. The emperor's condition mirrored that of the empire itself, vast, self-contained, and increasingly disconnected from its foundations. The Senate, once a living body of debate, had become a stage for obedience. Senators bowed before imperial decrees, recited praises, and competed for favor. The old traditions of mosmairum, the ways of the ancestors, had been replaced by ceremonies of submission. And yet, in public, everything appeared calm. The marble gleamed. The laws were obeyed. Rome, the eternal city, gave no outward sign of its inner corrosion. This duality, appearance and reality, surface and depth, became the defining pattern of imperial rule. The emperor was expected to embody divine perfection, even as he struggled with mortal fears. Each new ruler inherited not only the crown but the unspoken terror of failure. For to fail as emperor was not merely to lose power, it was to invite erasure. Rome did not remember its disgraced rulers kindly. Their names were chiseled from inscriptions, their statues defaced, their memory condemned in the ritual of damnatio memoriae. In such a world, paranoia was not madness, it was survival. Inside the imperial palace, even beauty could become oppressive. The walls were adorned with mythological scenes, gods ascending to Olympus, heroes triumphant in battle, lovers immortalized in marble. But these images meant to inspire could just as easily remind an emperor of his own mortality, his own inability to escape time. The laurel wreath, after all, was made of leaves that withered. The same crowds that cheered a triumph could turn silent at a hint of weakness. The burden of divine illusion weighed most heavily in private moments, in the long, sleepless hours when the city's noise faded and only the distant call of a night bird broke the stillness. The emperor, worshipped as God, would lie awake listening to the echo of his own thoughts. How does one live when one is no longer allowed to be human? The laurel on his brow pressed like a crown of thorns. Rome's rulers were not alone in this kind of solitude. Across centuries and empires, kings and conquerors have faced the same paradox that power isolates and isolation distorts the mind. But in Rome, where power had been made divine, the distortion was magnified. Each emperor was both ruler and symbol, human and myth, and as the empire expanded, that duality deepened, creating an endless pressure to maintain the illusion of divine composure even as cracks began to form within. By the time the moon rose above the Palatine, the city below was quiet again. The fires of the Subura glowed faintly, and the temples stood in stillness. The emperor's palace, once bright with ceremony, now seemed almost spectral, a monument not to triumph but to vigilance. Somewhere inside, beneath gilded ceilings, an emperor sat alone, aware that in the silence of the night, even the softest whisper might carry a threat. And so beneath the laurel crown, the shadow of madness began to grow, not sudden, not loud, but slow and patient, like a crack spreading through marble. The calm facade of Rome remained intact, but within its quiet halls, the descent had already begun. In the stillness of the Palatine night, long before emperors became divine caricatures and Rome's rulers dissolved into their own reflections, there was one man who set the pattern, one man who taught the empire how to look serene while trembling beneath its own weight. His name was Gaius Octavius, but history remembers him by another Augustus. He was the first emperor, though he never called himself that. To the people he was Princeps Civitatis, the first citizen, a phrase that disguised absolute control beneath the language of republican modesty. The transformation he oversaw was so smooth, so deliberate, that most Romans never realized the republic had died until it was long buried. The Senate still met, the consuls still wore their togas of office, and the rituals of old still filled the forum. Yet every law, every command, every gesture of state ran through Augustus. He understood, with chilling precision, that power did not need to announce itself. It only needed to appear calm, and so he built not an empire of fear, but of appearances. Marble, ritual, and myth became the new tools of control. When Augustus returned to Rome after years of civil war, the city was scarred and weary. Streets lay in ruin, temples half collapsed, and the old nobility had been thinned by decades of purges. He promised not conquest, but restoration. "I found Rome a city of brick," he would later say, "and left it a city of marble." The phrase became his epitaph, a truth in stone, but also a metaphor. For Augustus rebuilt not only the city's walls, but the illusion of harmony that would keep it obedient for centuries. Marble was permanence, but it was also silence. The new temples gleamed white and cold, reflecting the unchanging order he claimed to restore. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, stood as his greatest symbol, delicate reliefs of processions, sacrifices and calm faces of divine ancestry. No hint of war or blood remained in its design, though its peace had been bought through both. The monument whispered of divine favor, of destiny fulfilled. It said to every Roman who looked upon it, "The world is whole again," yet beneath that serenity was manipulation of the highest order. Augustus was not merely a ruler, he was the curator of perception. He knew the human mind's need for pattern, and he gave it one. He filled the empire with images of stability, his own likeness, youthful and composed, carved into stone across every province. The statues never aged. Even as he grew older, the marble Augustus remained eternally calm, his expression fixed in gentle wisdom, untouched by time. This too was deliberate. The divine cannot decay. The people, accustomed to seeing their leader unchanging, began to believe in the image more than the man. Worship crept quietly into governance. Temples to device Augustus appeared even before his death, and sacrifices were made in his name. But the emperor himself was not divine. He was cautious, calculating, and deeply aware of human fragility, his own above all. Behind the mask of serenity lay a man haunted by memory and distrust. The ghosts of the Republic lingered in his mind. He had seen betrayal up close. Brutus, Cassius, Antony, men who once shared his table and later drew their swords. Even after decades of power, Augustus never allowed himself to forget the instability beneath the marble. He surrounded himself with symbols of order, yet the act of maintaining that order consumed him. Every law, every appointment, every alliance was a balance between loyalty and fear. He married his daughter Julia into political alliances that later fractured. He adopted heirs, Gaius and Lucius, Agrippa Postumus, and finally Tiberius, only to see ambition and suspicion destroy them, one by one. To the public, he was the serene patriarch of Rome's rebirth. In private, he was a man trapped by the system he had created, a system that demanded perfect control and permitted no human weakness. Even his personal habits reflected this tension between calm and vigilance. He ate sparingly, spoke softly, and avoided extravagance. Yet his home on the Palatine, though modest by imperial standards, was filled with quiet omens, images of Apollo, god of harmony and light, whom Augustus claimed as his divine patron. The god of the lyre, the archer whose arrows struck without warning, was a fitting symbol. Augustus, like Apollo, ruled through balance and precision, but also through invisible threat. His governance brought stability to Rome after a century of chaos, but that stability carried a price. To ensure peace, he institutionalized obedience. The Senate learned to praise rather than oppose. The army swore oaths not to the state, but to the emperor himself. Religion became politics, and politics became ritual. The empire's citizens were taught to find comfort, not in participation, but in admiration. The result was something unprecedented, an empire at peace, yet utterly dependent on one man's will. Augustus had bound the empire's fate to his own image. It was efficient, elegant, and fragile. The moment that image cracked, the illusion would shatter. When Augustus died in 14 CE, at the age of 75, Rome mourned not only a ruler, but a symbol. His body was carried through the city he had remade, past temples and arches bearing his name. The people wept, the Senate declared him divine, and his ashes were placed in the mausoleum he had built for himself decades earlier. The ritual was perfect, serene, and final. But beneath the ceremony, a quiet unease began to stir. Augustus had been both architect and mask. He had built the machinery of empire, but also the performance of empire. Every emperor who followed would inherit that role, to be both god and man, symbol and subject, calm while terrified, and for some that contradiction would be unbearable. Tiberius, his reluctant successor, had watched Augustus all his life. He had seen how the man's calm face hid endless caution, how his smiles never reached his eyes. When the Senate hailed Tiberius as emperor, he hesitated, muttering that the task was too great for one man, that he would rather not accept it. But Rome had no choice. The mask could not be removed. The system demanded continuity, and so the laurel was placed upon his head, and thus the shadow behind the laurel deepened. The empire had found stability, but not peace. The man who founded Rome's golden age had also unknowingly laid the groundwork for its descent, a system that offered divinity but demanded silence, that glorified control but bred paranoia. In the glow of the eternal city, the marble still shone white and perfect, yet within the polished reflection of Augustus's calm face, the faintest tremor of madness waited, quiet and patient beneath the surface of the stone. The empire that Augustus built had been an empire of surfaces, calm, harmonious, deliberate. But when he died, that smooth marble facade began to show its first faint fractures. Into the space he left stepped a man who had studied order all his life and found only isolation beneath it. Tiberius Claudius Nero, the second emperor of Rome. Tiberius was not a man made for adoration. He lacked the warmth that had made Augustus beloved, the charisma that could make power seem almost natural. He was tall, reserved, and prone to long silences. The people saw in him something remote, as though his thoughts moved in darker places. He had been a soldier first, not a ruler, a commander whose patience on campaign was matched by a deep suspicion of human motives. Augustus had chosen him only after losing every other heir. His grandsons Gaius and Lucius dead young, Agrippa posthumous exiled and murdered, and the line of succession reduced to necessity. When Tiberius ascended the throne in 14 CE, he did so reluctantly. His first acts were cautious, almost deferential. He kept the Senate active, preserved the titles of the Republic, and insisted that he did not wish to rule as a king. Yet beneath that modest language lay a weary intelligence. He knew that Rome's system of shared power was now an illusion, that the Senate's decrees meant little without imperial assent. He had inherited not a partnership, but a performance, and he played his part with growing resentment. At first his rule was competent, even admirable. He strengthened the frontiers, curbed extravagance, and enforced discipline in administration. But his distrust grew with every passing year. He began to see in the Senate not gratitude, but flattery, not loyalty, but self-interest. The careful courtesies that had once held Rome together now struck him as hypocrisy. He spoke of liberty, but surrounded himself with informers. Every word in the city seemed to carry two meanings, one for the speaker, another for the imperial spies who listened in silence. By the 20s CE, his disillusionment had hardened into withdrawal. He had lost his son Drusus, and with him the last person he truly trusted. The imperial palace, once a symbol of majesty, had become a place of confinement. The air in Rome was thick with intrigue. Ambitious men, among them the infamous Lucius Aelius Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, whispered promises of loyalty while plotting their own ascendancy. To Tiberius, the city itself had become a stage of deceit, and so in the year 26 CE, he left it behind. He sailed south across the Bay of Naples, past the fertile plains of Campania, toward a rocky island rising from the sea, Capri. The island was small, only a few miles across, but its cliffs rose sharply above the waves, offering both beauty and isolation. From its highest point, the emperor could see the distant haze of the mainland, faint and unreachable. Here the sea was a constant sound, waves breaking against stone, the low hum of wind through cypress trees, the distant cries of gulls. Tiberius found in that monotony a strange kind of solace. He built his refuge there, a network of villas connected by winding paths, overlooking blue depths that shifted with the light. The most famous was the Villa Jovis, a vast complex of terraces and colonnades, pools and chambers, perched like an eagle's nest on the cliff edge. It was both fortress and monastery. Here the emperor lived surrounded by silence and sea, attended by a handful of guards, servants and secretaries who moved about like ghosts. To the Romans who remained in the capital, this retreat became the stuff of rumor. They imagined orgies, cruelty, madness. stories later embellished by historians who loved the spectacle of imperial decay. But the truth, as it often is, was quieter. Tiberius's exile on Capri was not a carnival of pleasure, but a deep withdrawal from humanity. He read endlessly, wrote letters of instruction, and obsessed over reports from the mainland. His agents sent him lists of accusations, names of suspected conspirators, fragments of gossip overheard in taverns or at the baths. Every rumor became a possible threat. Every threat a justification for execution. In his absence, Sejanus grew powerful. The commander of the Praetorian Guard had once been a servant. Now he was the emperor's voice in Rome. He purged rivals, reshaped the Guard into a personal army, and cultivated an image of loyalty that concealed his ambition. For nearly a decade, he ruled in Tiberius's name, his influence reaching every corner of government. The empire seemed stable, but beneath its still surface ran undercurrents of fear. When Sejanus finally fell, exposed in 31 CE for plotting against the emperor, his downfall was swift and merciless. He was executed, his body thrown down the Gemonian stairs, and his family hunted to extinction. Rome convulsed in paranoia. Senators denounced one another in desperate acts of self-preservation. Tiberius, watching from Capri, sent orders with cold precision. The city he had once sought to control now destroyed itself through fear of him. In his letters, fragments of which survive in the works of Tacitus and Suetonius, one senses a mind that had turned inward beyond repair. He wrote of duty, of fate, of the treachery of mankind. He spoke of the gods with ambiguity, not as a believer, but as one who saw divinity as another form of tyranny. His tone was calm, detached, but beneath that calm was a bitterness that had curdled into fatalism. The island, once a retreat, became a mirror of his mind, beautiful, enclosed, and haunted by echoes. Visitors spoke of the emperor, walking alone along the terraces, gazing out to sea for hours, his face unreadable. The sunlight that glittered on the waves could not reach the darkness of his thoughts. He had fled Rome, but not himself. In 37 CE, after more than a decade of seclusion, Tiberius died at Misenum, on the mainland. The circumstances remain uncertain. Some sources claim he died naturally at 77, others, that his successor Caligula ensured his death by smothering him with a pillow when he briefly revived. What is certain is that his passing was greeted in Rome with a strange mixture of relief and dread. The people had long ceased to think of him as a man. He had become a distant, invisible force, a presence that lingered in the empire like an unending storm. When news of his death reached the capital, there were celebrations in the streets. The Senate hesitated, as it always did, until it was clear the emperor would not rise again. Statues were torn down, coins melted, his name cursed, and yet for all the hatred, his reign had preserved the empire's stability. The frontiers had held, the treasury was full. Order, though harsh, had endured, but the cost had been immense. The emperor's fear had infected the entire body of Rome. Suspicion had become habit, obedience a reflex. The system that Augustus had built to preserve serenity now sustained itself through silence and dread. Far out on the island cliffs of Capri, the waves continued to break against stone, as they had when Tiberius still walked its terraces. The empire's heart had shifted from marble to mist, from the visible to the unseen, and somewhere within that mist, Rome's long descent into the madness of its emperors had truly begun. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, Rome felt the first breath of release it had known in years. The long silence of Capri had ended. The emperor who ruled from shadows was gone. In his place came light, or so it seemed. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the son of the beloved general Germanicus, stepped forward to the cheers of a weary empire. He was young, handsome, and most importantly, the grandson of Augustus's line through adoption. To the people, this was more than succession, it was restoration. They called him by the name that had followed him since childhood, Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname given by the soldiers who had adored him as the mascot of his father's legions on the Rhine. To them he was the promise of joy after years of suspicion. In his first months as emperor, Caligula seemed to fulfill every hope. He abolished treason trials, recalled exiles, and restored public games. The city, long starved of celebration, came alive again. Statues of Tiberius were quietly removed, and coins bearing Caligula's image spread across the empire like tokens of rebirth. The Senate praised him as Princeps Optimus, the best of princes. Crowds gathered wherever he appeared, desperate to catch a glimpse of the smiling young ruler. For a brief, dazzling moment, Rome remembered what happiness felt like, but joy, like empire, rarely lasts. In October of that same year, Caligula fell ill, violently and mysteriously. The fever lasted for weeks, and for a time it seemed the young emperor would die. When he recovered, something in him had changed. The open warmth of his early rule cooled into something stranger, more erratic. Those around him began to notice the silences between his words, the moments when his gaze seemed to drift beyond the room, as though he were listening to something only he could hear. Some ancient writers, like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, would later call this illness the dividing line, the moment when reason fractured and delusion took root. But madness, as it so often does, rarely begins in a single instant. It grows slowly, almost invisibly, in the spaces where power and isolation meet. Caligula had inherited not only an empire but the loneliness of command. The Senate deferred to him with the same terrified reverence they had shown Tiberius. His guards watched his every movement, not out of care, but duty. Friends were impossible. Trust, a memory. The Palatine Hill, filled with marble and echoes, became a labyrinth of flattery and fear. In that hollow quiet, Caligula began to see himself differently. The divine language that had once been symbolic under Augustus, temples, cults, godlike honors, became in his mind literal. He was not merely the emperor, he was something greater. He began to speak of himself as a living deity. Temples to his genius were built across the empire. Statues of gods were ordered to have their heads replaced with his own likeness. In Rome he appeared dressed alternately as Apollo, Mercury, even Venus, the divine taking on mortal form. Yet even this was not mere arrogance. It was in its way an act of desperation, an attempt to make the unbearable weight of solitude feel meaningful. To believe oneself divine was to make isolation sacred. The accounts of his reign blur the line between truth and legend. Ancient historians, writing decades later, delighted in portraying him as monstrous, a catalogue of excess and cruelty. They wrote of his banquets of gold, his laughter at executions, his command that the sea be flogged for disobedience. They told stories of his horse, Incitatus, made consul, of incest and blasphemy, of his dream to make himself a living god over the Senate. Yet when the layers of rumor are peeled away, what remains is more haunting than grotesque. Caligula's madness was not the fire of chaos, but the slow cooling of humanity under the chill of absolute power. He was a young man surrounded by gods and ghosts, told since birth that his bloodline was divine, and left with no one who dared tell him otherwise. In private moments, witnesses said he would speak to statues as though they could answer him. He walked the empty corridors of the Palatine at night, calling the names of those long dead, his father Germanicus, his mother Agrippina the Elder, his brothers, all victims of the court's paranoia under Tiberius. He had seen them die or vanish into exile. Now he ruled in their place, their shadows whispering from the marble. The line between the living and the remembered grew thin. Even his cruelty, when it appeared, was methodical rather than impulsive. He seemed to test the limits of what was real, to see how far fear could bend obedience before breaking. He would summon senators to his palace and fall silent, letting the pause itself become threat. He ordered executions not for crime, but for the reassurance that he still could. By 39 CE, his erratic rule had exhausted Rome's patience. The treasury was drained by his spectacles, games, races, temples to himself. His relations with the Senate deteriorated into open contempt, yet his power, like all power in Rome, rested not on love but control. The Praetorian Guard remained loyal, if only through pay and habit. The people still shouted his name in the circus, though more from tradition than affection. But even the mechanisms of empire cannot sustain madness forever. Beneath the noise of public adoration, conspiracies began to stir. Senators whispered of restoration, of the republic that had died generations before. Officers in the Praetorian camp spoke in cautious tones about duty to Rome. In January of 41 CE, the whisper became act. During a festival at the Palatine, Caligula walked through a corridor lined with guards. Among them stood Cassius Chaerea, a tribune who had endured the emperor's mockery for years. As Caligula passed, Chaerea struck first, a sudden silent motion. The emperor fell before his attendants could react. The blows that followed were numerous, almost ritual. When it was done, the young god-king lay dead in a passageway of his own palace, his blood soaking into the marble. Outside, Rome froze in confusion. Some celebrated, others hid. The Senate debated restoring the Republic, but their courage evaporated by morning. The Praetorian Guard, moving quickly, found Caligula's uncle Claudius trembling behind a curtain. They proclaimed him emperor, and once again the cycle began. Fear disguised as order, chaos dressed as continuity. Caligula's body was burned in haste. His ashes were buried in the gardens of Lamia, away from the Palatine's haunted halls. Yet his memory lingered, not as the monster the historians would later create, but as a warning carved into the history of Rome, that even divine power cannot cure the loneliness of the human mind. The empire continued, its marble polished, its ceremonies unchanged. But beneath that surface, something irreversible had happened. The line between ruler and deity, once symbolic, had blurred beyond repair. The imperial crown, once a mask of serenity, had become a mirror reflecting the fractures within. And in that reflection, another figure soon emerged, older, cautious, and underestimated. A man who had watched the madness of others and thought himself immune to it. When Caligula's blood dried on the marble floors of the Palatine, the empire did not stop. It hesitated, then resumed its rhythms, as if Rome itself had become too vast to pause for any single man's death. Senators convened, the Praetorians chose, the people gathered in the forum, whispering not of liberty, but of continuity. The man who emerged from behind the palace curtains, Claudius, uncle to the slain emperor, was trembling when the guards found him. He had survived by being invisible, mocked for his stammer, his limp, his awkwardness. But invisibility in Rome was its own kind of armor. When the Praetorians hailed him as emperor, he accepted not from ambition but from instinct, a scholar dragged onto a stage he never meant to stand upon. Yet the stage was already set. Rome by now had grown accustomed to rule as performance. The forms of the Republic remained, senatorial decrees, legal debates, elections, but all of it unfolded beneath the shadow of imperial presence. The emperor was both actor and audience, the arbiter of spectacle. The people had learned to look upward for meaning, and those above had learned to act for their gaze. What had once been the machinery of politics had become theatre. Senators rose in the curia, not to speak their minds, but to recite loyalty. Courtiers rehearsed their gestures of admiration, perfecting expressions of fear and devotion. Even executions, once the solemn conclusion of law, were conducted as public events, designed to demonstrate the emperor's justice, or his wrath, or, in the cruelest irony, his mercy. It was no longer simply an empire of territory, it had become an empire of appearances. The transformation had been gradual. Augustus had begun it with his careful control of image, statues, poetry, the myth of peace. Tiberius had deepened it through absence, ruling as the unseen presence. Caligula had turned it inside out, making performance itself his dominion. And now, in the years following his death, the pattern hardened into ritual. Claudius, for all his scholarly good intentions, found himself trapped within this theatre. His reign brought relative stability, reforms, even modest prosperity, Yet beneath it all, the structure of spectacle remained. He delivered speeches to the Senate that few dared to question. He presided over trials where outcomes were predetermined, and when he appeared before the people, he did so as the living emblem of imperial endurance, the idea that Rome could survive anything, even its own madness. But the deeper truth was more unsettling. Rome no longer expected sanity. It had learned to function without it. The historian Tacitus, writing later, would describe this transformation with restrained bitterness. The empire, he said, had taught men to be silent, to measure their words by the mood of the emperor. The Senate applauded decrees it privately despised. The people celebrated victories they did not understand. Fear, once private, had become collective, expressed through ritual obedience. In the amphitheaters, the principle reached its purest form. Here, violence and spectacle merged completely. Gladiatorial games, executions, and reenactments of myth blurred the line between life and performance. The crowd became both participant and judge, roaring approval as men died for their amusement. The emperor's presence sanctified it all. A god among spectators, deciding with a gesture whether a life was spared or ended. This habit of theatre spread through every level of society. Provincial governors staged triumphs in miniature. Generals paraded captives as symbols of Roman destiny. The empire's architecture itself became part of the illusion. The marble facades, the triumphal arches, the inscriptions proclaiming divine favor. Everywhere, image supplanted substance. The world was arranged not for function but for effect. And yet, beneath the grandeur, unease grew. Those who lived within this spectacle began to sense that performance had replaced reality. Senators bowed not to men, but to shadows of power. The people cheered emperors they neither loved nor understood. The more absolute the ruler, the less human he seemed, and the more inhuman the world around him became. By the time of Nero, Claudius's adopted son, the transformation was complete. The young emperor, raised amid courtiers and poets, inherited not only an empire but a stage already lit. His reign would push this theatricality to its breaking point. Under Nero, the boundaries between art and power dissolved entirely. He saw himself as a performer first, a musician, a poet, an actor whose audience was the world. To rule Rome was to direct it. He composed songs, staged plays, and demanded that the nobility attend his recitals. Senators who failed to applaud with enthusiasm risked their lives. What had begun as political ritual under Augustus now became literal theatre. The emperor, standing in silk robes before the crowds, sang of gods and heroes while Rome itself watched in obedient silence. It was no longer madness in the private sense, it was collective. The empire had learned to applaud even as it trembled. In this strange harmony of fear and fascination, one can glimpse the soul of imperial Rome, a civilization that understood itself through performance. The emperor's face on coins, his image in temples, his name in oaths, all of it composed a symphony of illusion. The people no longer cared to see the man behind it. They wanted continuity, not truth. Even the historians, writing later, struggled with the paradox. Was Rome insane, or simply exhausted? Was its love of spectacle a symptom of decay, or a coping mechanism for survival? Perhaps both. Because in the great amphitheater of empire, no one could step outside the play. The senators who condemned innocents to please the emperor were as much victims as the condemned. The crowds who cheered the fall of tyrants only prepared the stage for the next, and the emperors themselves, trapped by divine expectation, performed until the performance consumed them. When Nero would later take the throne, he inherited not merely power, but an audience, an empire trained to confuse grandeur with truth. The curtains had long been drawn. All that remained was to continue the play, no matter how dark the script became. In the long, uneasy twilight that followed Caligula's assassination, Rome seemed unsure whether to breathe or hold its breath. The Senate debated restoring the Republic. The people murmured uncertainly in the streets. Power, for a brief and dangerous instant, hung without an owner. Then, in a quiet corner of the Palatine Palace, soldiers found a man hiding behind a curtain. He was trembling, half in shock, half in disbelief. His name was Tiberius Claudius, Caesar Augustus Germanicus, uncle to the dead emperor, scholar, historian, and now, by the will of the Praetorian Guard, ruler of the Roman world. It was an improbable coronation. Claudius had lived much of his life on the margins of imperial attention. Born in 10 BCE, he was the nephew of Tiberius and the younger brother of Germanicus, whose popularity had once made him the darling of Rome. But Claudius had never been a figure of admiration. His limp, his stammer, and his awkward manner had branded him as weak, unfit for command, unfit for public life. The imperial family had hidden him away, more embarrassment than air. Yet, in that obscurity, Claudius found something the others never could: time to think. He read, studied, and wrote history, linguistics, the origins of Etruria, the workings of law. While his relatives played at godhood, Claudius learned the slow patience of scholarship. It was, in its way, a different kind of preparation, one not for glory, but for endurance. When he was declared emperor in 41 CE, many saw him as a puppet, a harmless, malleable figure the Praetorian Guard could control. But the quiet man behind the curtain soon revealed a mind sharper than anyone had guessed. He began by securing loyalty where it mattered most, the military and the bureaucracy. He paid the guard generously, ensuring their protection, and filled administrative posts with freedmen chosen for competence rather than lineage. It was an unconventional move to elevate former slaves into positions of power, but Claudius understood the logic of survival. Senators might despise him, but freedmen owed him everything. Under Claudius, the machinery of empire began to turn again, not with Caligula's manic energy, but with cautious rhythm. He repaired aqueducts, reformed the legal system, and oversaw the expansion of Rome's bureaucracy. He extended citizenship to provinces that had long waited for acknowledgement, integrating them into the heart of Roman life. And against the counsel of many, he authorized the invasion of Britain in 43 CE, a campaign that succeeded, marking one of Rome's last true conquests. To the people he seemed almost humble. He attended the Senate, spoke respectfully, and sought to restore the appearance of reasoned government. But beneath this moderation ran the old currents of fear. The same mechanisms that had crushed dissent under Tiberius and Caligula still hummed quietly in the background. The informers, the treason trials, the atmosphere of suspicion that clung to every corner of the palace. Claudius tried to balance between reason and survival, but in Rome, reason was never enough. He married several times, each union reshaping his political fortunes. His most infamous wife was his niece Agrippina the Younger, ambitious, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. Through her son Nero, Claudius sought to secure a stable succession. But Agrippina's designs were larger than stability. She had grown up in the same imperial labyrinth that had destroyed her mother and brothers. She knew that safety in Rome was never given. It was taken. While Claudius labored to maintain a fragile equilibrium, Agrippina built her own network of influence. Flatterers, guards, advisors, all aligned toward one goal: ensuring that her son would inherit the throne. Even as Claudius sought to govern rationally, the atmosphere of paranoia persisted. Senators smiled too quickly. Freedmen whispered among themselves. Letters from the provinces spoke of plots, betrayals, and quiet revolts. The emperor, who had once written history, now found himself living inside its most dangerous chapter. The irony of his reign was almost tragic. He, the historian, understood the lessons of Rome better than anyone. He knew how swiftly emperors could fall, how absolute power corroded those who held it. He sought to govern by moderation, yet moderation, in the imperial system, looked like weakness. His attempts to temper justice were seen as indecision, his patience as naivete. He moved through the palace as though walking on the edge of a blade. By day he presided over trials with measured deliberation. By night he read alone, surrounded by scrolls and silence, trying to lose himself in the clarity of the past. The lamps flickered against the marble, and the shadows seemed longer than they should have been. And always beyond the doors, the empire murmured. By 54 CE, Claudius was in his mid-60s, weary but still capable. He had outlasted the conspiracies, navigated the court's shifting loyalties, and secured Rome's prosperity. Yet he was also surrounded by those who wanted him gone. Agrippina, now at the height of her influence, saw that her son's time was near. The story, as later told by Tacitus and Suetonius, holds that Claudius's death came by poison, a dish of mushrooms, served with the same ceremony as any imperial meal. Whether that tale is fact or invention hardly matters. It was entirely in keeping with Rome's pattern, emperors rising in fear, ruling in vigilance, and dying by the hands closest to them. When Claudius died, the Senate hesitated once more, then declared his divinity, the same ritual sanctity granted to all who died upon the throne. His image joined the gallery of imperial gods. His name, once mocked, was now inscribed among the eternal. In his stead rose Nero, Agrippina's son, young, impressionable, and raised in the shadow of manipulation. The boy emperor inherited an empire that functioned like a well-rehearsed play, the Senate feigning respect, the people performing loyalty, the machinery of paranoia spinning beneath the surface. Claudius had tried to slow it, to bring reason back to the marble stage, but the system he inherited could not be reasoned with. It had become self-sustaining, a theatre in which even sanity was a role one had to perform. As the funeral fires of Claudius faded, Rome turned once more towards spectacle. The scholar who had tried to restore sense to madness was gone, and in his place, a new generation stepped forward, eager for applause. The stage was ready. The lights once again began to rise. The smoke from Claudius's pyre had not yet faded from the skies when Rome found itself in the presence of a new kind of emperor. His name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, barely 17 years old, slender, with a calm, almost luminous face that hid the labyrinth of ambition and fear already coiling behind his eyes. He had been raised under the watchful gaze of his mother, Agrippina, whose hand had guided his every step toward the throne. But now, as the empire bowed before him, Nero began to imagine a crown that did not fit anyone else's head, a crown not of iron or laurels, but of art. Rome at first adored him. Youth promised renewal. After the aging caution of Claudius, Nero seemed like morning light spilling through columns long shadowed by bureaucracy and suspicion. His first speeches, likely written by the philosopher Seneca, were measured, humble, and full of promises of clemency. He announced that the Senate would once again share in governance, that the excesses of Caligula and the paranoia of Tiberius would not be repeated. There was laughter in the forum again. Citizens whispered that perhaps the gods had forgiven Rome at last. But in the marble halls of the Palatine, the transformation had already begun. Nero had been raised not for administration, but for spectacle. He loved performance, music, poetry, the rhythm of applause. His education had been shaped by tutors like Seneca and Burrus, men of reason. But what thrilled him was not the balance of philosophy, it was the tremor of emotion, the way a crowd could be moved not by laws but by beauty. Power, for Nero, was not something to wield, it was something to stage. The palace changed accordingly. What had once been a seat of governance began to resemble a theatre. Lamps burned late into the night, illuminating private concerts. Musicians, poets, and actors filled the courtyards. The young emperor played the lyre, recited verses, and invited the city's elite to witness what he called divine expression. Senators clapped dutifully. Some, unwilling to applaud too softly, learned to cheer with the exaggerated fervor that kept one's head attached. Agrippina, who had once controlled every detail of her son's rise, began to sense her influence slipping. Nero resented her presence, her voice, her reminders that he ruled only because she had placed him there. The tension grew quietly, then fatally. In 59 CE, Agrippina was murdered, first by a failed attempt at shipwreck, then, when she survived, by direct assassination. The act sent a tremor through the empire. The boy who had seemed like dawn was now shrouded in a different kind of light, colder, sharper, more theatrical. The years that followed blurred into a strange performance of contrasts. Rome prospered materially. The economy was stable and public entertainment flourished. Nero's grand projects, theatres, temples, baths, gave the illusion of a thriving age. But beneath the stone and spectacle, paranoia thickened. Informers multiplied. Senators disappeared quietly. Executions became quieter, cleaner, like the backstage work of a vast production. It was in 64 CE, however, that Nero's name became inseparable from fire. That summer, flames erupted in the shops near the Circus Maximus. The fire spread quickly, leaping across wooden structures, feeding on dry winds. For 6 days Rome burned, and then, after a brief lull, for 3 more. Ancient temples collapsed. Entire districts vanished in red smoke. The city, the living heart of empire, melted into ruin. Later generations would accuse Nero of having started the fire himself, of watching from his palace as the city burned, playing his lyre and singing of Troy's fall. The truth is harder to separate from myth. Ancient sources disagree. Tacitus wrote that Nero was in Antium when the fire began, and that he returned to organize relief. He opened his gardens to the homeless and provided food for the displaced. Yet, the rumor persisted, and perhaps that was enough. Nero, stung by accusation and desperate to redirect blame, turned his wrath upon a small misunderstood sect, the Christians. They were still an obscure group, viewed with suspicion by the public. Nero's persecution was brutal and calculated. Crucifixions, executions, and burnings designed as public warning and macabre entertainment. It was, historians say, the first official persecution of Christians in Roman history, and it marked a turn in Nero's own descent. In the fire's aftermath, Nero's imagination grew more extravagant. He envisioned rebuilding Rome not as it had been, but as a monument to himself, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. This palace was less a residence than a dream made stone. Walls gilded with gold leaf, fountains whispering through gardens, artificial lakes reflecting the stars. It sprawled across the Palatine Hill like an emperor's shadow. When completed, Nero is said to have remarked, "At last I can begin to live like a human being." But the cost of beauty was immense. Taxes increased, discontent simmered in the provinces. The Senate's patience thinned, and generals on distant frontiers began to measure their own chances at rule. Even his mentors, Seneca and Burrus, distanced themselves. Burrus died. Seneca was forced into retirement, then accused of conspiracy and compelled to take his own life. Nero's isolation deepened. The court around him became an echo chamber of flatterers. He performed publicly in Greece, competing in musical contests where no one dared declare another victor. The emperor of the world waited for applause like a child, and always the crowd obliged. In the quiet hours of the night, Nero's Rome seemed to shimmer between 2 realities, one of marble and order, the other of feverish illusion. The line between art and cruelty blurred completely. A poorly received poem could cost a man his life. A whispered doubt could end a family. The emperor's moods became law. By 68 CE, the empire began to rebel. The legions of Gaul and Spain rose in defiance, declaring their generals as rightful emperors. Even the Praetorian Guard, once the pillar of his rule, turned against him. Nero fled the city that had once adored him, taking only a few loyal servants. The Senate declared him a public enemy. On June 9, 68 CE, he took refuge in a villa outside Rome. Hearing the sound of soldiers approaching, Nero realized the performance was over. According to the accounts, he murmured the words "Qualis artifex perio," "What an artist dies in me," and drove a dagger into his throat. He was 30 years old. The empire, weary and silent, entered another of its long pauses, that heavy stillness that followed every fall. The theatres closed. The Golden House stood empty, glinting in the sunlight, the dream of a man who had mistaken applause for eternity. And yet, even as Rome began to move on, the story of Nero refused to fade. For centuries afterward, whispers persisted that he was not truly dead, that he would return, disguised, to reclaim his stage. The myth of Nero's return haunted the edges of empire like a ghostly encore. The city he had burned was rebuilt, its scars hidden beneath marble and mosaic. But the air of performance, of spectacle as rule, of illusion as governance, never entirely left Rome. The empire had learned, under Nero, that madness could wear the mask of beauty. And somewhere beneath the foundations of his golden house, in the tunnels of memory, the lyre still trembled faintly in the dark. When the dagger fell from Nero's trembling hand, and the last of his bloodline's music fell silent, Rome did not cheer. It exhaled, a long uncertain breath, as though waking from a fevered dream. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled for nearly a century, had ended not with conquest, but with collapse. The marble family that had once claimed descent from Venus herself now lay in ruin, its veins emptied, its lineage extinguished in poison, exile, and the quiet erosion of trust. In the early days of the empire, the Julio-Claudians had seemed eternal. They were the architects of Rome's transformation, from republic to empire, from Senate rule to imperial dominion. Augustus had built the foundations, Tiberius had maintained them, Caligula had mocked them, Claudius had repaired them, and Nero had adorned them with gold until the structure cracked under its own weight. Their names were carved into every frontier, inscribed on every monument. Yet behind the stone, their family had decayed, like fruit left too long in sunlight. The dynasty had begun, as many great ones do, with a myth. Julius Caesar, though dead long before the empire's birth, had set the pattern, power concentrated in one man, cloaked in divine lineage. His adopted heir, Augustus, perfected it, carefully merging the authority of a monarch with the rituals of a republic. He ruled by illusion as much as decree, presenting himself as princeps, the first citizen, even as he wielded absolute control. For 40 years, he maintained that delicate balance. But power, once centralized, could not be divided again. It was inherited like a disease, passing not only the throne but the paranoia that came with it. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, ruled from the shadows. Caligula, his great-nephew, turned those shadows into theatre. Claudius, his nephew, tried to tame the machinery. Nero, Claudius's adopted son, surrendered to its madness. Each step, each generation, moved further from stability and closer to implosion. The family that had once presented itself as the divine guardians of Rome had become its own curse. After Nero's death in 68 CE, no direct heir remained. The Julio-Claudians, a line that traced itself to Augustus through blood and adoption, had been consumed entirely by their own history. The names still echoed: Germanicus, Agrippina, Drusus, Julia, but they now existed only as whispers in old court records and in the bitter recollections of survivors. The empire itself, though vast and disciplined, trembled without its central figure. The Senate, which had long pretended to share authority, found itself suddenly responsible for decision. The Praetorian Guard, the very force that had created and destroyed emperors, looked for direction and payment. The provinces, sensing weakness, began to stir. It was a strange kind of peace, one not born of stability, but of exhaustion. Rome had learned to endure madness by ritual, executions, conspiracies, purges. These were the rhythms of governance now. The absence of a Julio-Claudian emperor felt almost unnatural, as though the empire had lost the dark heartbeat that kept it alive. In the weeks after Nero's suicide, rumors spread that he was not truly dead. Impostors appeared in the eastern provinces, claiming to be the resurrected emperor. Some gathered followers, others were quietly executed. The persistence of these pretenders revealed something deep in the Roman psyche, not love for Nero himself, but dependence on the illusion of divine continuity. To lose the Julio-Claudians was to admit that Rome's god-born dynasty had been human after all. The family's destruction had not come from outside enemies, but from within its own blood. Poison had replaced the sword, exile, the battlefield. The list of those consumed reads like a dirge. Julia, Augustus's only daughter, exiled for scandal. Agrippa posthumous, his grandson, executed in secrecy; Germanicus, poisoned amid whispers of imperial jealousy; Drusus, Tiberius's son, starved in his own home by his mother's schemes; Agrippina, the elder, beaten to death in exile; Caligula, stabbed by his own guards; Claudius, poisoned by his wife; Agrippina, the younger, slain by her son; Nero, dying by his own hand. Each death formed a thread in a tapestry woven entirely of fear. What began as a dynasty of destiny ended as a cautionary fable about the corrosion of power. The marble temples still stood, the Senate still met, the legions still marched along the Rhine and the Euphrates, but the sense of sacred inheritance, of divine right, was gone. Rome, for the first time in living memory, was a world without an heir. The Julio-Claudian palace on the Palatine fell into partial disuse. Its corridors, once echoing with the footsteps of emperors and the rustle of courtiers, now stood silent. Dust gathered on frescoes depicting gods and victories. The gardens grew wild. Statues cracked in the sun. The empire's heart, that symbolic home of the family, became a relic almost overnight. Writers of the age, like Tacitus, would later describe the dynasty's fall not as tragedy but as inevitability. It had been built on too fragile a foundation, on manipulation, myth, and the illusion that divine blood could cleanse human ambition. Augustus had tried to shape history into permanence. History, patient and cold, had simply waited for the illusion to dissolve. And yet, beneath the melancholy of the dynasty's fall, there remained a strange, persistent admiration. For all their madness, the Julio-Claudians had given Rome its identity. They had defined what it meant to rule, and in doing so, what it meant to lose control. Every emperor who came after would measure himself against their legacy, their triumphs, and their catastrophes. As the sun set over Rome that summer of 68 CE, smoke still drifted faintly from the ruins left by Nero's fire. The Tiber moved quietly beneath its bridges. Merchants reopened their shops, as they always did. The city, eternal in its ability to forget, began to move again. But for those who had lived through the dynasty's long shadow, there lingered a sense that something immense had ended, not just a family, but a belief. The empire would continue, stronger even, under new names and new ambitions. Yet it would never again possess the mythic stillness of its first century, that delicate balance between illusion and power that Augustus had conjured and his descendants had destroyed. The Julio-Claudians had devoured themselves, leaving only ashes, and in those ashes, the faint reflection of their former grandeur. Out of those ashes, however, something new was stirring, a struggle for the vacant throne that would soon plunge Rome into one of its most chaotic and uncertain years. Armies would march not for glory, but for legitimacy. Generals would rise and fall with the seasons. The empire was not dead, but it was hungry again. And as night fell over the Palatine, the wind whispered through the abandoned corridors of a dynasty, carrying with it the echo of voices that once believed themselves immortal. After Nero's death, Rome entered a silence that felt heavier than peace. The marble city, long accustomed to the steady rhythm of a single ruler, now pulsed with uncertainty. There was no heir, no divine blood left to inherit the purple. The empire had grown used to tyranny as a kind of stability, and in its sudden absence the world seemed to sway. The year was 68 CE turning into 69, a year that would see 4 emperors rise and fall in swift succession, each declared by a different army, each claiming legitimacy through force rather than heritage. The Senate, once the heart of governance, had become little more than a mirror reflecting whichever general's face loomed nearest to Rome. When Nero died, the first to seize opportunity was Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. He was elderly, austere, and already long disillusioned with Nero's excesses. His soldiers, loyal more from discipline than devotion, declared him emperor, and the Senate, desperate for order, ratified the decision. It was the easiest path. To call a distant governor emperor was less dangerous than facing the chaos of the streets. Galba entered Rome, not as a conqueror, but as a relic. He walked slowly, his face lined with the weariness of age, his manner that of a man accustomed to command, but unaccustomed to affection. The city greeted him with cautious applause. The statues of Nero were pulled down, but the old emperor's ghost lingered in every marble corridor. Galba's rule, though brief, would reveal a cruel truth. Rome no longer cared who ruled, only that someone did. He tried to restore discipline, to rebuild what he imagined was the old virtue of the Republic. He cancelled Nero's extravagant programs, reclaimed gifts, and punished corruption with rigid severity. But the empire was tired of virtue. The Praetorian Guard, expecting reward for their loyalty, found themselves ignored. The legions along the Rhine, restless and unacknowledged, whispered mutiny. Galba, austere and unbending, mistook obedience for stability. He had been emperor for barely 7 months when the first cracks appeared. Among his officers was a young, ambitious man named Marcus Salvius Otho, a former friend of Nero and one-time husband to Poppaea Sabina, the woman Nero had taken as his own. Otho had supported Galba's rise, expecting in return the adoption that would make him heir. When Galba instead named another, Otho began to plot. On a cold morning in January of 69 CE, as Galba rode through the Forum, the Praetorians turned against him. The crowd parted silently as soldiers surrounded the litter. The old man tried to dismount, to speak, but the words never came. The blades flashed briefly, and when they were done, Galba lay still upon the stones of the city he had tried to discipline. His head was displayed to the people, carried on a spear. Rome had seen this before, it would see it again. Otho was proclaimed emperor the same day. His reign began with the promise of peace. A man of charm, familiar with both luxury and politics, he restored favor to those Nero had once delighted, perhaps believing that the people wanted not justice, but comfort. But in the provinces, far from the Roman streets, another man was rising, Aulus Vitellius, commander of the German legions. Vitellius's soldiers, loyal to their general and resentful of being excluded from Rome's decisions, declared him emperor before Aulus' new regime could settle. The empire, now divided by distance, braced itself for collision. Armies moved like shifting tides, banners unfurling along the Rhine, through the Alps toward Italy. The battles that followed were not glorious. They were weary, methodical, fought by soldiers who understood that victory no longer meant peace. At the first battle of Byzantium, near Cremona in northern Italy, Aulus' forces met Vitellius's legions. The fight lasted a single day. Dust rose, blood soaked the spring soil, and by dusk the outcome was clear. Aulus, hearing the news, did not wait for capture. In his tent, he wrote a final letter, urging mercy for his soldiers, and then took his own life with calm deliberation. His body was burned with honor. Even those who had fought against him wept. It was, in its strange way, the last noble gesture Rome would see for some time. Vitellius entered Rome in triumph, greeted by processions, banquets, and promises of indulgence. He was no tyrant, only weak, generous with gifts, careless with power. He sought to please everyone, and thus controlled nothing. The empire, spread across continents, could not be governed by feasts and familiarity. His officers grew corrupt. The treasury emptied. The same legions that had raised him up began to grumble. Far to the east, in the province of Judea, another general watched the empire crumble. His name was Titus Flavius Vespasianus. Vespasian. He had fought in Britain under Claudius, crushed revolts, and now led the campaign in the Jewish war. A soldier's soldier, plain-spoken and pragmatic, he was the opposite of Nero's theatricality. When word reached his camp that Rome was again leaderless, his legions proclaimed him emperor. By this time, Rome was used to new banners. The people no longer cheered, they waited. The Senate, having learned obedience through repetition, declared Vespasian emperor as soon as his intentions were clear. But Vitellius still sat in the palace, dining as armies approached. The final struggle came again at Bedtime, the same fields where Otho had fallen months before. The Flavian forces advanced from the east, their discipline honed by years of war. Vitellius's men demoralized and disorganized, could not resist. Rome fell into chaos. Fires burned again in the streets, and corpses lined the marble steps of the Capitol. On December 20th, 69 CE, Vitellius was dragged from hiding and killed. His body was thrown into the Tiber, the river that had carried the ashes of so many forgotten ambitions. When Vespasian finally entered Rome, there was no celebration left. The empire was not jubilant, it was exhausted. 4 emperors had ruled in a single year, each destroyed by the machinery of their own soldiers. The empire had become a reflection of itself, vast, efficient, but hollow at the center. The Julio-Claudian illusion of divine rule had ended. What remained was power stripped of myth, cold and procedural. Vespasian's arrival marked the beginning of something quieter, a restoration of order, perhaps, or at least the appearance of it. He rebuilt the treasury, reasserted military discipline, and began work on monuments that would later define his dynasty, including the great amphitheater that would become known as the Colosseum. But in that winter of 69 CE, before the reconstruction began, Rome lay still, its citizens uncertain whether they lived in an empire or an echo. The marble walls bore the scars of yet another civil storm, and the Tiber flowed on, indifferent. The empire, though bloodied, had survived. But something essential had changed. The divine family was gone. The idea of sacred continuity was gone. What remained was power itself, faceless, restless, and enduring. And as night settled again over the Palatine Hill, where once Augustus had dreamed of eternity, only the wind moved, carrying the faint rustle of discarded banners, the quiet murmur of soldiers asleep beside their shields, and the weary breath of a world learning that order, once broken, could never again be whole. When Vespasian finally entered Rome in the winter of 70 CE, the city was quiet in the way a battlefield is quiet after the last clash of steel. The marble gleamed under a pale sky, but smoke still clung to the arches, and the scent of burning lingered faintly along the streets. The empire, weary and fractured, looked upon its new emperor not with celebration but with cautious relief, like a patient unsure whether the fever had truly broken. He was no patrician, no descendant of gods. Titus Flavius Vespasianus came from Arete, a small town in the Sabine Hills, born to a family of modest rank. His father was a tax collector, his mother of equestrian class, respectable but unremarkable. He was a soldier, not a poet, a builder rather than a dreamer. He spoke plainly, moved deliberately, and laughed often at things emperors were not supposed to find amusing. In a city that had grown used to the manic theatre of Nero and the brittle vanity of Galba and Otho, this blunt practicality seemed almost foreign. Rome did not rise to greet him with cheers. It merely waited. The streets were lined with citizens who had seen too much, too many processions, too many corpses, too many emperors whose names faded before their statues were finished. When Vespasian ascended the rostra and addressed the Senate, his voice was calm, unembellished, firm. There were no promises of divine lineage, no talk of destiny. He spoke instead of repair, of restoration, of debt and discipline. He spoke of the treasury, empty, and the legions disordered. He spoke of roads needing mending, aqueducts requiring stone, and citizens needing bread. His rule began not with glory, but with rebuilding. The empire under Vespasian was like a vast estate left untended, its foundations solid but its gardens overgrown. He began pruning immediately. The Senate, once ceremonial, found itself again part of governance, at least in appearance. The military, demoralized by years of shifting loyalties, was restructured. He reduced the power of the Praetorian Guard, scattered potential threats, and reminded the legions that discipline, not ambition, was their purpose. Yet for all his practicality, there was a certain warmth to Vespasian's rule, an almost domestic humor, that contrasted with the cold grandeur of his predecessors. Ancient sources describe him as laughing, easily, mocking even his own authority. Once, when attacks on public latrines brought complaints, he held a coin to his nose and remarked, Money does not smell. It was crude perhaps, but effective. The empire's finances stabilized, and the phrase pecunia non olet endured for centuries as a quiet testament to his realism. Still beneath the humor, there lingered the faint, unspoken tension of Rome's recent memory. The palaces of the Palatine were haunted by whispers. Nero's golden house still glittered across the valley, its vast colonnades reflecting light like a wound that refused to close. Vespasian could not ignore it. The Domus Aurea, that monument to imperial vanity, became both symbol and burden. Where Nero had once sought to turn Rome into a stage, Vespasian sought to turn it back into a city. He ordered parts of the Golden House filled in, its gardens repurposed, and its artificial lake drained. Upon its site, he began the construction of an amphitheatre, the largest the world had ever seen. It would be called the Flavian Amphitheatre by its builders, but in time the world would call it the Colosseum. The irony was quiet but profound. The monument that would come to define imperial Rome was born from the ruins of a madman's dream. This act of transformation, of turning excess into utility, defined his reign. Roads were repaired, aqueducts restored, provincial governance stabilized. In Judea, his son Titus completed the brutal siege of Jerusalem, ending the Jewish revolt and bringing immense spoils to the empire. The Arch of Titus would later immortalize that conquest, soldiers carved in relief carrying the menorah from the temple, a silent procession of victory frozen forever in stone. Vespasian's reign was not without its cruelties. He could be harsh when discipline demanded it, and his restoration of order came through force as much as policy. The philosophers who had criticized imperial overreach found themselves exiled or executed. The Senate's revived dignity was in truth an illusion tightly managed. Yet compared to the hysteria of past decades, his rule felt almost merciful. The empire could breathe again, even if the air remained heavy with memory. At night, the city took on a new kind of silence, not the tense quiet of fear, but the weariness of recovery. Lamps flickered in rebuilt taverns, artisans worked late under the hum of tools, and in the forum the marble statues stood once more upright, their bases scrubbed of soot. Rome was not reborn, it was simply repaired. In the provinces the change was felt as well. Governors once chosen for their loyalty now faced scrutiny for their competence. Tax systems were regularized, and roads again filled with merchants and messengers. Even in Egypt, where Vespasian had been hailed as a living god by the priests of Serapis during his campaign, the cultic devotion served his purpose, the divine aura restored, but now disciplined by pragmatism. The historians of the age, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, would later note how ordinary Vespasian seemed. He was not a visionary like Augustus, nor a philosopher like Marcus Aurelius would be. He was a man of practical mind and unpretentious manner, who viewed empire not as destiny but as management. His humor, at times coarse, was itself a form of control. It humanized him in a system that had deified too many. When he fell ill in 79 CE, his death came with the same wry detachment that had colored his life. According to Suetonius, as he felt himself slipping away, he whispered, "Oh dear, I think I am becoming a god," mocking the tradition that made emperors divine after death. Even in his final breath, he refused the illusions that had consumed those before him. After his passing, his son Titus took the throne, and for a brief moment, Rome believed in benevolence again. The city continued to hum with construction, the Colosseum nearing completion, its arches already casting long shadows across the reclaimed grounds of Nero's lake. The empire exhaled once more, steady, measured, almost peaceful. But the ghosts did not leave. In the marble corridors of the Palatine, the air still carried the memory of madness. Of Tiberius's isolation, Caligula's delusions, Nero's performances. Vespasian had rebuilt Rome's body, but its soul still trembled under the weight of its past. The empire had survived, yes, but it had not healed. And as the sun set over the Tiber, The light touched the new amphitheater's pale stone, golden for a moment, then fading to shadow. The empire, restored, stood once again serene and solemn, its surface immaculate, its foundations uneasy. The marble gleamed, but beneath it, the old fractures remained, waiting for the next tremor. The empire had exhaled under Vespasian, and for a moment under Titus, it even smiled. The amphitheater was complete, its arches alive with cheering crowds. The fire of 79 CE had scarred the city but not broken it, and when Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii that same year, Titus's compassion, his open grief, seemed to promise that the age of cruelty was finally done. But peace in Rome was never more fragile than when it appeared sincere. In 81 CE, as the empire still murmured with the echoes of reconstruction, Titus fell ill and died at the age of 41. The cause remains uncertain, fever perhaps, or poison, though the whispers pointed toward his younger brother Domitian. Whether or not those whispers were true, they would shape the tone of the new reign, for Domitian was born not into confidence, but into doubt. When he ascended the throne, the empire once again found itself beneath a watchful gaze. Domitian had lived long in the shadows, overshadowed by his father's competence and his brother's charisma. Now, with both gone, he emerged not as a savior, but as a man determined to be obeyed. The Rome he inherited was orderly, stable, and prosperous, but it was also brittle, its memory still fresh with the chaos of civil war. Domitian would ensure that such chaos never returned, though his means would make the cure worse than the disease. At first his rule seemed cautious, even admirable. He paid the legions regularly, reformed coinage, rebuilt temples, and continued his father's architectural projects. He restored discipline among the troops and justice among the magistrates. For a while the empire murmured approval. The Senate, wary but compliant, praised him publicly. But beneath the calm administration, a new tension began to coil, invisible at first, then unmistakable. Domitian sought not merely to govern but to perfect. He saw corruption everywhere, disloyalty in every glance. He demanded efficiency, precision, reverence. He reintroduced censorship, punished moral decay, and demanded that all address him as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. The title was not entirely new. Emperors before him had been deified in retrospect. But Domitian's insistence on divine acknowledgement, while still alive, shifted the balance again, from rule to worship, from emperor to idol. Rome changed with him. The laughter of Vespasian's era faded into formality. Senators spoke carefully, never too loudly, never too warmly. The forum grew quieter. Words were weighed before being spoken. The marble that had seemed to breathe again under the Flavians began to hold its breath once more. Statues multiplied across the city. Domitian's image carved in stone, bronze, and silver, his eyes fixed and expressionless. His likeness stood in temples, baths, and military camps. They were meant to inspire unity, but they watched instead, turning Rome into a city of silent witnesses. It was said that, even in private gardens, small busts of the emperor were placed, as if to remind the people that solitude was an illusion. The Palatine Hill, which had once echoed with music and conversation, grew hushed. Courtiers moved like ghosts through its corridors. It was no longer a place of laughter or counsel, but of ritual and control. Those who served close to the emperor learned to read the smallest shifts in his expression, the slightest tightening of his jaw, as signals of favor or ruin. Domitian worked tirelessly. He woke early, governed directly, reviewed petitions himself, and enforced his vision of moral rectitude with mechanical precision. He banned castration, prosecuted adultery, and revived the ancient office of censor perpetuus, granting himself lifelong authority over public morals. Yet the more he tried to shape Rome into virtue, the more it recoiled beneath his scrutiny. He rebuilt the city's appearance, completing the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, reconstructing the Circus Maximus, and adorning the Palatine with new halls of marble and gold. The Flavian Palace, his creation, was vast and intricate, designed not merely for residence but for intimidation. It was a palace meant to be seen, not lived in, an architecture of authority. Its long corridors amplified footsteps, its courtyards reflected the emperor's shadow onto polished stone, every surface whispered control. Beyond the capital, Domitian's reach extended into the provinces. His military campaigns along the Rhine and Danube strengthened borders, his reforms improved provincial administration, and his attention to detail ensured a rare degree of stability. But this very precision bred resentment among the elite. To the Senate, he was not a reformer but a tyrant who bypassed their dignity. To the philosophers, he was the enemy of free thought. To his spies and secretaries, he was both master and threat. The purges began slowly, a senator accused of treason here, a philosopher banished there. The charges were often vague: impiety, conspiracy, insult to the emperor's majesty. Accusation became a kind of currency, traded among the fearful to prove their own loyalty. Rome became a place of rehearsed praise, where silence was safer than sincerity. Those who remembered Caligula's madness or Nero's excess found Domitian's reign colder, more deliberate. His cruelty was not impulsive but calculated. Executions were private, tidy, often justified through law. Even fear itself had become administrative, and yet there was method in his severity. Under Domitian, the frontiers held firm, corruption lessened, the treasury grew strong. The common people, shielded from the intrigues of the elite, often prospered. Bread was distributed, games continued, and order reigned. To the masses he was a protector, to the powerful he was an oppressor. In time, the weight of this invisible tension became unbearable. Whispers began once more, quiet, cautious, the same way they had begun in the days of Nero. Those who served closest to Domitian plotted in secrecy, knowing that discovery meant death, but hoping that absence of action meant worse. On September 18th, 96 CE, after 15 years of rule, Domitian was assassinated, stabbed in his own palace by members of his household, including his chamberlain and his wife's steward. The Senate, hearing the news, did not mourn. Statues of the emperor were torn down, inscriptions erased. His name was condemned to damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Rome would pretend he had never been, but marble remembers what people wish to forget. The halls he built still stood, the roads he paved still bore soldiers' feet, and the quiet fear he nurtured outlived him. The empire had again learned how to survive tyranny by silence, how to smile under suspicion, how to wait for the next ruler without hope or despair. Domitian's death marked the end of the Flavian dynasty, a line that had begun with laughter and ended in whispers. Yet his reign, for all its chill, left Rome more disciplined, more centralized, more efficient. He had built an empire that could function without love, and that perhaps was his most enduring legacy. As night fell over Rome that autumn evening, the Palatine windows reflected the dim red of torches. The city, having seen too much, did not rejoice loudly. It simply absorbed the news and carried on. Somewhere beyond the Tiber, a marble statue of the emperor still stood, half shattered, its eyes empty, staring into nothing, the perfect image of the silence he had built. By the time Hadrian came to power in 117 CE, the empire was vast enough that its own borders began to blur in the imagination of its rulers. From the sands of Egypt to the forests of Germania, from the granite cliffs of Britannia to the deserts beyond the Euphrates, Rome seemed infinite. But even infinite things cast long shadows, and Hadrian, educated, restless, and introspective, could sense that expansion had reached its quiet limit. He inherited the world from Trajan, the great conqueror, who had carried Rome's banners farther east than any before him. When Trajan died during his campaign in the east, the empire stood at its largest extent. Yet, beneath the triumph, there was exhaustion. Too much land, too many frontiers, too little certainty. Hadrian, his adopted son and successor, understood that empires could break not through defeat, but through overreach. Where Trajan had sought conquest, Hadrian sought containment. His reign began not with new wars, but with withdrawals, a reversal of imperial momentum. He abandoned Mesopotamia, returning to the natural frontiers of the Euphrates. He strengthened the Rhine and Danube defenses. It was a move many criticized at the time, retreat, they called it, but Hadrian saw it as preservation. Empire, like marble, required not just expansion but balance. Hadrian was no ordinary emperor. He was a student of philosophy, a lover of architecture, a poet, and a man haunted by thought. His mind moved in symmetry. He saw in the geometry of walls and domes something like peace, an order the world itself rarely offered. He spoke Greek more fluently than Latin, read the dialogues of Plato, admired the austerity of the Stoics. To the soldiers, he seemed distant, to the scholars, divine. He was also a traveler, perhaps the most restless emperor Rome ever knew. Unlike rulers who governed from the Palatine Hill, Hadrian took the empire into his own hands, walking its roads, inspecting its legions, studying its temples. For over half his reign, he was away from Rome, in Gaul, in Britannia, in Egypt, in Asia Minor, moving not as conqueror, but as caretaker. The empire became his classroom, and the world his map of reflection. In Britannia, he saw the cold mist and endless moors of the northern frontier. The legions stationed there, weary, wind-battered, standing among rain and heather, faced tribes beyond the reach of civilization. Hadrian recognized the futility of endless campaigns in this bleak landscape. Instead of advancing, he drew a line, a wall that would hold both barbarians and ambition at bay, stretching from sea to sea across northern England. Hadrian's wall was both practical and philosophical. It was a defense, yes, but also a boundary between order and wilderness, between the known and the unknowable. The stone rose slowly, measured and exact, mile by mile, turret by turret. Soldiers labored, engineers calculated, and Hadrian's presence lingered over every plan. The wall was his thought made visible, a line of restraint carved into the earth. In time, the wall would come to symbolize not Rome's power, but its limits, the first acknowledgement that empire must sometimes stop and breathe. Yet to Hadrian, this acknowledgement was not defeat. It was wisdom. His journey continued south through Gaul and into Spain, where he visited the land of his ancestors near Italica. There, among olive groves and red soil, he reflected on his lineage, a Spaniard by birth, ruling a Roman world. Perhaps he found comfort in the idea that empire had transcended ethnicity, that Rome had become not a people, but a principle, a system of order that could absorb the world. He built wherever he went, temples, baths, fortresses, libraries, all marked by the same calm geometry. In Athens, his beloved city, he completed the temple of Olympian Zeus, begun centuries earlier by others. He built a library, adorned the city with new colonnades, and established festivals in honor of Greek culture. To the Greeks, he was more than emperor. He was a philosopher king. His architectural masterpiece, however, would rise back in Italy. The Villa Adriana at Tivoli, spread over hundreds of acres, it was less a palace than a landscape of imagination. Courtyards, reflecting pools, gardens and libraries, arranged in near-perfect symmetry. It was a map of his mind. Every dome and portico, a meditation in stone. In its still waters, one could see not only the reflection of the emperor, but the reflection of his loneliness. For though Hadrian was surrounded by beauty, he was never free from sorrow. His greatest attachment, the young Greek Antinous, drowned mysteriously in the Nile during one of the emperor's journeys. The loss hollowed him. In grief he did what only an emperor could do. He transformed memory into monument. He founded the city of Antinopolis in Egypt, commissioned statues of the boy across the empire, and allowed his cult to spread like a quiet hymn through marble halls. Antinous became immortal, a god of beauty, youth, and death. It was a gesture that revealed as much about Hadrian's heart as about his philosophy. He could not conquer death, so he built walls against forgetting. He could not command love, so he enshrined it in eternity. The empire, for all its discipline, became a mosaic of grief, temples, arches, and statues that spoke not of conquest, but of remembrance. In his later years, Hadrian returned to Rome. He was older, heavier, his health failing. The man who had travelled the world now withdrew into his villa, surrounded by the echoes of water and stone. The empire he left was stable, its borders defined, its roads maintained, its architecture resplendent, yet his final years were shadowed by melancholy. He had loved the idea of perfection, but he had come to understand its cost. The more he sought to control, the more he felt the futility of human order. He wrote poetry, verses of longing and resignation. His famous death poem, Animula Vagula Blandula, Little Soul, Wandering Gentle, captures this quiet acceptance. The words written to his own departing spirit are simple, unadorned, the emperor's final whisper to himself. When Hadrian died in 138 CE, he left behind a Rome of marble and memory. His mausoleum, built by his own design, would later become the Castel Sant'Angelo, a fortress, then a prison, then a relic of another age. The empire did not mourn wildly, it merely adjusted, as it always did. Yet his reign marked a turning inward, from conquest to contemplation, from motion to form. Hadrian's walls in Britain, in Tivoli, in his own mind, were not barriers of fear, but expressions of control, of the fragile human desire to shape the infinite. And as the centuries passed, his constructions endured, outlasting kingdoms and languages, standing as reminders that even empires, when they grow wise, begin to build walls not to keep others out, but to hold themselves together. At dusk, the light still falls softly on the remains of Hadrian's wall, the stones faintly gold against the wind. The silence there is deep, not empty, but full of memory. It is the silence of an emperor who finally found peace, not in victory, but in the stillness of limits. When Hadrian died, he left behind an empire of balance and design, an empire shaped by reason. His successors, Antoninus Pius and then Marcus Aurelius, continued that legacy, guiding Rome through decades of relative peace and philosophical rule. But the calm was deceptive. Beneath the polished marble of the Antonine era, something ancient and primal still breathed, the hunger for spectacle, the intoxication of absolute power. And when that hunger finally found a host, it took the form of Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius had been the philosopher-emperor, a ruler who wrote meditations on virtue while commanding armies against invading tribes along the Danube. His reign was marked by discipline, duty, and stoic endurance. He sought not glory but harmony, to live according to nature, as the Stoics taught. But even philosophers have blind spots, and Marcus's greatest error was one of the heart. He broke with the Roman tradition of adopting the worthiest successor, and instead passed the empire to his own son. In 177 CE, Commodus became co-emperor alongside his father. He was barely 15, beautiful, arrogant, and utterly untested. Marcus, weary and aging, hoped to mold him into a philosopher king. But the boy who sat beside him in the imperial tent during campaigns on the cold frontiers of Germania was not a thinker, he was an actor. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, the world mourned the end of the Golden Age, and with Commodus's ascension, that golden light dimmed into the first shades of decadence. At first, Rome celebrated its new ruler. The people loved his youth, his appearance, his bloodline. Statues were raised, coins minted, games announced, but it did not take long for the tone to change. The senators began to whisper, the legions grew uneasy. Commodus was different, unpredictable, vain, theatrical. Where his father had written meditations on the nature of the soul, Commodus gazed into mirrors, imagining himself as Hercules reborn. It began with symbols. He ordered statues of himself in the lion skin of Hercules, holding the club of the demigod. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The months of the calendar became the names of his titles: Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Hercules, Romanus. ex superatorius. The empire's institutions, once bound by law and reason, were now props in his theatre of divinity. Commodus saw himself not as emperor, but as God incarnate, and gods in his mind owed no explanation to mortals. But his madness did not express itself in isolation like Tiberius, nor in manic cruelty like Caligula. Commodus's descent took the form of performance. He found his stage not in the Senate, but in the amphitheatre, the Colosseum itself. At first it began privately, within the palace. He took to sparring with gladiators, delighting in their skill and submission. But soon he wanted the adoration of the crowd, the roar of the plebeians, the heat of the sand. He descended into the arena dressed as Hercules, club in hand, and demanded to be hailed as Dominus Deus, Lord God. The Roman people, long conditioned to worship spectacle, complied. It was said that Commodus fought hundreds of bouts, though in truth, his opponents were hand-picked to lose, and often armed only with wooden swords. He slaughtered wild animals too, lions, leopards, bears, from behind the safety of a platform. He called these victories divine manifestations. To the people, it was entertainment. To the Senate, it was humiliation. The Colosseum had once been a symbol of Roman grandeur. Now it was an altar to imperial madness. Senators were forced to attend these performances, cheering as their emperor pretended to fight as a god. Some whispered that the spirit of Caligula had returned, that Rome's circle of madness had come full. The corruption deepened. Those who displeased him were executed or exiled. Those who flattered him rose swiftly. The Praetorian Guard, once protectors of imperial dignity, became his private instrument of terror and indulgence. Commodus rewarded them lavishly, buying loyalty with gold and blood. His sister Lucilla, who had once shared the imperial stage as the daughter of Marcus Aurelius, grew fearful of his insanity. In 182 CE, she conspired with senators to assassinate him, but the plot failed. Lucilla was executed, and Commodus's paranoia metastasized. He withdrew trust from all, surrounded himself with flatterers, and retreated deeper into delusion. He renamed the legions in his honor. The grain supply of Rome became the Annona Commodiana. Even the Senate he renamed the Commodian Fortunate Senate. Every edict, every coin, every monument carried his name. The empire was no longer Rome. It was a mirror in which only Commodus's face could exist. Yet through all his madness, the empire still functioned. Barely. The bureaucracy ran itself. The provinces endured, and the legions along the frontiers held the line. It was as if Rome had grown so large, so entrenched, that it could survive even a god on the throne. But gods grow bored easily, and Commodus's boredom was lethal. He began to stage more elaborate spectacles. Once he ordered hundreds of disabled men to be cast into the arena, dressed as monsters, so he could slay giants. Another time, he beheaded ostriches and mocked senators by brandishing their heads. His nights were filled with feasts, drugs, and orgies, his days with games and executions. He was the emperor's actor, and Rome his eternal audience. The empire's grandeur had become grotesque performance art. The senators wept silently in the stands, the people cheered for blood, and the marble city that Hadrian had adorned with geometry now trembled beneath applause. But power built on spectacle cannot last. By 192 CE, his inner circle, exhausted and terrified, began to plot against him. His mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latus conspired together. They could no longer control him, they could only end him. On the last night of the year, Commodus prepared to appear in public as consul, dressed again as Hercules, carrying his club. He planned to rename the year after himself. Rome was to begin its calendar anew, born again in his divine image. But that night, as he soaked in his bath, he drank wine laced with poison. When that failed to act quickly enough, a wrestler named Narcissus, once Commodus's sparring partner, entered the room and strangled him. The emperor god died gasping in the steam, his reflection rippling in the bath water. He was 31 years old. When news reached the Senate the next morning, Rome erupted in strange relief. Statues were torn down. His name was declared cursed, erased from inscriptions. The empire for a moment could breathe again. Yet the scars of his reign lingered. The empire had gazed too long into the mirror of its own madness. The philosopher's son had become the clown of the gods, and in his fall, the illusion of Rome's eternal virtue shattered once more. What Marcus Aurelius had built through discipline and reason, Commodus had undone with vanity and delusion. The walls Hadrian built to hold the empire together could not contain the rot that now spread from its heart. The Senate restored order for a moment, declaring Pertinax emperor, but the stability was fragile. The throne, once sacred, was now a prize for the boldest bidder. The empire had survived madness before, but never had it looked so much like entertainment. The death of Commodus in the last hours of the year 192 CE left Rome adrift, leaderless, weary, and quietly trembling. For the first time in generations, the empire had no natural heir, no preordained successor waiting in the shadows. The throne that had been wrapped in divinity and bloodline now stood exposed, and its emptiness beckoned like a wound. The Senate moved swiftly to restore dignity. They proclaimed Pertinax, a seasoned senator and former military man, as emperor, a choice meant to signal reason after madness. Pertinax was respected for his discipline, his simplicity, his moderation. He spoke of restoring the old Roman virtues, of bringing back a government of restraint and principle, but idealism in Rome was always a fragile currency. The Praetorian Guard, those same imperial bodyguards who had once strangled Commodus, now demanded their price. Pertinax had promised them discipline instead of gold. They wanted the reverse. When he refused their demands for an enormous donative, a traditional payment upon a new emperor's accession, they turned on him. In March 193 CE, scarcely 3 months after his coronation, the Praetorians stormed the palace and cut him down. Then, in an act that would echo through centuries of Roman shame, they auctioned the empire to the highest bidder. From the blood-stained steps of their barracks they shouted offers to wealthy senators. It was Didius Julianus, a rich noble, who bid the highest, promising each soldier vast sums in gold. They declared him emperor, not by lineage, not by law, but by purchase. Rome, once the mistress of the world, was now a commodity. The Senate, humiliated and terrified, ratified the choice, but the provinces did not. In the legions stationed far from the capital, outrage burned. To the soldiers hardened on the frontiers, this auction was blasphemy, proof that the heart of empire had rotted beyond repair. 3 generals rose in rebellion: Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Septimius Severus in Pannonia, commander of the Danubian legions. Of the 3, Severus moved fastest. He was a soldier of African birth, shrewd, patient, and coldly ambitious. His legions were loyal, his officers disciplined, and his intentions clear. By June 193 CE, Severus had marched into Rome. Didius Julianus was executed, his bought crown melting away like wax in sunlight. Severus disbanded the Praetorian Guard, those corrupt arbiters of imperial fate, and replaced them with men from his own legions. For the first time in decades, the empire had a soldier emperor who commanded through strength rather than inheritance or illusion. It felt for a moment like restoration. Severus proclaimed himself the avenger of Pertinax, adopting the dead emperor's name and promising renewal. But this restoration was not built on stoic virtue or republican memory. It was built on the iron discipline of the army and the cunning of a man who knew that peace in Rome could only be secured through control. He moved swiftly to eliminate his rivals. Marching east, he crushed Pescennius Niger near Issus, the same ancient battlefield where Alexander had defeated Darius centuries before. Then he turned west, defeating Clodius Albinus in Gaul. By 197 CE, Severus stood alone, emperor of all Rome. The blood of his rivals soaked into the soil of 2 continents. He ruled from strength, not philosophy. He was pragmatic, ruthless, efficient. The Senate became ornamental, a chamber of silence and applause. The empire's real foundation shifted to the army. It was the soldiers now who made emperors, not laws, not lineage. To the people of Rome, Severus's reign brought a surface calm. Grain flowed again from Africa. Roads were repaired, cities rebuilt, frontiers fortified. The empire's treasury swelled with the spoils of his conquests. Yet this prosperity was deceptive, a mirage shimmering across a desert of decay, for beneath the order lay the quiet transformation of Rome from a state of laws into a barracks of obedience. Severus's reforms restructured the empire around the military. Provincial governors were often soldiers rather than senators. Civil administration became an extension of command. The emperor's word replaced deliberation. In the marble halls of the Palatine, the echoes of debate faded. The empire had become a disciplined machine, strong, efficient, and soulless. But Severus was not blind. He knew the empire's stability depended not just on victory, but succession. He sought to secure his legacy through his sons, Caracalla and Geta. He brought them into his councils, paraded them before the legions, and declared them joint heirs. It was an echo of Marcus Aurelius's ideal, a father passing wisdom to sons. But the sons of Severus were not philosophers. They were rivals, and their rivalry would drown Rome in fratricide. In his final years, Severus marched north into Britain, waging war against the tribes beyond Hadrian's Wall. Old, ailing, and weary, he still led from the front, a soldier until the end. He built new fortifications, repaired the walls of stone and turf, and ordered campaigns into the fog and heather of Caledonia. His health worsened, but his resolve did not falter. In 211 CE, in the city of Eboracum, modern York, Septimius Severus died. His last words to his sons were reportedly simple, almost weary in their truth. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. It was both a warning and a prophecy. The Severan dynasty that followed, Caracalla, Geta, Elagabalus, Alexander, would enrich the soldiers but destroy the harmony. The empire that Severus had fortified would soon buckle beneath his own design. When his funeral procession wound through the streets of Rome, the people cheered the image of strength, the illusion of permanence. His ashes were placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian, the same monument that had held emperors who built through philosophy and order. Now, it held the architect of Rome's militarized soul. In the years to come, the Severan dynasty would continue to shine like polished bronze, bright, reflective, and hollow. The empire's surface glittered with stability, but its foundations, the Senate, the civic order, the ideals of shared rule, were eroding quietly beneath ambition and fear. Rome had found, once again, not peace but a pause, a fragile equilibrium maintained by soldiers' loyalty and imperial gold. The same forces that had saved the empire from chaos would in time consume it. The marble still gleamed under the sun. The aqueducts still carried water. The legions still saluted. But the empire's heartbeat had changed. It no longer pulsed through the Senate or the laws, but through the camps and barracks of distant provinces. The age of the philosopher was over. The age of the soldier had begun. The Severan mirage glowed faintly for a generation, a reflection of strength cast over widening cracks. And when it faded, Rome would wake to the sound of marching feet, a reminder that discipline without conscience is merely another form of decay. And as the dust settled over the northern wall where Severus's last breath lingered, another shadow began to rise, the restless figure of a son whose hands would soon be stained with his brother's blood. When Septimius Severus died in the cold mists of Britain, he left behind an empire bound by strength but hollowed by suspicion. His two sons, Caracalla and Geta, returned to Rome as joint emperors, a pairing as doomed as any mythic brotherhood. Within months the walls of the palace echoed with their rivalry, and the blood of one soaked its marble floors. Caracalla emerged alone, the empire's unity purchased through fratricide. For a time he ruled as a soldier among soldiers, fierce, brutal, efficient. His reign was a continuation of his father's military state, disciplined but joyless, marked by conquests and massacres. Yet even iron empires rust. Caracalla's murder in 217 CE at the hands of his own guard ended the Severan line's illusion of order. The throne once again stood vacant, haunted by its own reflection. Into that vacancy stepped Elagabalus, a boy barely 14, brought to power not by inheritance nor merit, but by the ambitions of his mother and grandmother. He was born Varius Avitus Barcianus, priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal, from whom he took his imperial name. His rise began in the desert province of Syria, far from Rome's decaying heart. There, under the endless light, his family claimed divine ancestry. His grandmother, Julia Maza, was the sister of Julia Domna, the late wife of Septimius Severus. When Caracalla was assassinated, Maza spread the rumor that her grandson was Caracalla's illegitimate son, a child of divine descent. The legions in the east, weary of civil war and seduced by the promise of Severan blood, proclaimed the boy emperor. He marched westward, carried not by experience or strategy, but by faith and spectacle. The new emperor entered Antioch beneath banners embroidered with suns and stars, surrounded by priests of his god. His armies followed not merely a ruler, but a prophet. By 218 CE, after defeating the forces of Macrinus, the brief usurper who had ruled after Caracalla, the young emperor entered Rome. And from that moment, the old gods began to tremble. Rome had seen madness before, emperors who fancied themselves gods, artists or philosophers. But Elagabalus represented something stranger, not insanity born of isolation, but ecstasy born of faith. He did not merely claim divinity, he believed himself to be its vessel. He brought with him from Emesa a black conical stone, sacred to the sun god Elagabal. To him it was no mere idol, it was the living presence of the divine, older than Jupiter, purer than Rome's pantheon. He built for it a vast temple on the Palatine Hill, the Elagabaleum, and declared that the sun god was supreme over all others. The ceremonies began at dawn and ended in the shimmer of sunset. Processions through the city streets with golden chariots, silk-robed priests, and garlands of roses. The emperor himself, dressed as high priest, led the rituals, his young face painted, his hair perfumed, his arms bare beneath jeweled robes. To the Romans who watched, it was both mesmerizing and alien, the language of another world being spoken at the heart of their own. But Rome was a city of tradition, and tradition does not yield easily to new sons. The Senate murmured, the praetorians watched in silence. The common people, long accustomed to divine emperors, found themselves bewildered by one who worshipped something other than Rome. In his palace, Elagabalus blurred all boundaries. The imperial halls that had once echoed with stoic debate now glowed with incense and drums. The emperor performed strange rites, mixing Roman gods with Syrian deities, marrying divine symbols in ceremonies few understood. He declared that the stone of Elagabala had married the goddess Vesta, symbolically uniting East and West. To many it was blasphemy, the desecration of Rome's sacred flame. Yet to Elagabalus it was revelation. He sought to make beauty and power indistinguishable. The emperor appeared in silks of scarlet and gold, wore makeup, and demanded to be addressed as both ruler and priest. He delighted in transforming the rigid codes of Roman masculinity into performance. Ancient sources, Cassius Dio, Herodian, and the Historia Augusta, describe his gender expression with fascination and scorn. He took female lovers, but also male. He dressed in women's clothing. He asked to be called lady rather than lord. In the imperial records, he exists as a figure both divine and dissonant, luminous and tragic. The old aristocracy could not comprehend him. To them, the emperor was the embodiment of Roman virtue, yet here was one who treated rule as ritual theatre. But to the crowds, he was a spectacle. He hosted banquets where guests were showered with petals until they suffocated. He released exotic animals into the streets. He built fountains that flowed with wine. Rome, long accustomed to decadence, now lived in dreamlike excess, and yet, behind the festivals and perfumes, isolation deepened. The emperor's grandmother, Julia Maesa, who had engineered his rise, began to see the danger. The Praetorian Guard grew restless. The Senate seethed. The rituals that had once enchanted the populace now felt suffocating. The empire's administrators complained that the emperor neglected governance for worship. Taxes rose, grain prices wavered, soldiers went unpaid. As whispers grew louder, Maesa turned to Elagabalus's cousin, a quiet boy named Alexander Severus, calm, intelligent, and obedient. She presented him to the legions as co-heir, hoping to steady the dynasty. Elagabalus saw in him not kinship, but threat. Paranoia crept into his rituals. He began dismissing and executing officials, accusing them of blasphemy or treason. His religious fervor curdled into fear. He demanded absolute loyalty to his god and himself. The city's patience thinned. In March 222 CE, it ended quietly, as such things often do. During a procession meant to reaffirm his divine authority, the Praetorian Guard turned on him. Julia Maesa stood aside, silent. Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soponaeus, were seized and killed within the camp. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, stripped of robes and jewels, and thrown into the Tiber. The black stone of Elagabal was returned to Syria. The temple he had built became a curiosity, a relic of a fevered experiment in faith and beauty. The boy who had dreamed of uniting heaven and empire was erased. His name struck from inscriptions, his memory cursed by decree. But in his short, dazzling reign, Elagabalus had exposed something that Rome could not unsee, the fragility of its identity. For centuries, Rome had absorbed gods, languages, and peoples into its vast body. Yet when confronted with a god it could not control, one that demanded not worship but transformation, the empire recoiled. The sun god's child had tried to merge east and west, body and spirit, art and rule. He failed, but in his failure, he illuminated the fractures of the age, a civilization exhausted by its own contradictions. When Alexander Severus ascended the throne, the empire sighed with relief, believing youth could again restore order. But the light that had flickered so violently in Elagabalus's reign left a strange afterglow, a reminder that Rome's heart, once marble, was now a mirror, reflecting not reason but yearning. And beneath that calm reflection, the old corrosion continued. The death of Elagabalus was meant to restore balance. Rome, weary of incense and delirium, looked once more toward order, toward the quiet, scholarly figure of Alexander Severus, the last of the Severan line. He was young, guided by his mother Julia Mamaea, tutored in philosophy and devoted to reason. He read Marcus Aurelius, worshipped the old gods, and even honored the new one from the east, the God of the Christians, hoping that tolerance might heal what faith had divided. For a time it seemed to work. The empire breathed again, taxes stabilized, the Senate found its voice, temples were repaired, statues restored, and laws revised. The empire's edges, from the Rhine to the Euphrates, were once again tended like a garden, not ravaged like a battlefield. It was, as one historian later wrote, a peace too fragile to be called peace. But beneath the reforms, something had changed forever. The empire's marble, still gleaming under the sun, was beginning to crack. The disease that had once taken the form of mad emperors now seeped into the structure itself, invisible, slow, inevitable. Rome had grown too large for its own reflection. Its cities stretched from the moors of Britain to the sands of Arabia, each speaking in accents of Latin and Greek, each carrying the imperial seal as both badge and burden. But communication faltered, armies grew autonomous, and loyalty became a matter of geography rather than faith. Alexander Severus ruled gently, and gentleness, in that age, was mistaken for weakness. The soldiers who once served gods now served themselves. Discipline eroded in the camps, and the frontiers murmured with revolt. In 235 CE, at Mainz, during a campaign against the Germanic tribes, The emperor who had sought reason was struck down by his own men. His mother was killed beside him. Their bodies were left unburied, exposed to the northern rain. With that act, something broke that would never fully heal. The Severan dynasty ended, and with it, the illusion of continuity. What followed was not chaos in the streets, but silence, a kind of paralysis. The empire still functioned. Laws were issued, coins were minted, festivals held, but everything felt thinner, as if Rome's soul had retreated behind its monuments. The next 50 years would later be called the crisis of the 3rd century, but in its beginning, it did not feel like a crisis. It felt like exhaustion. Emperors came and went, each proclaimed by an army, each promising to restore what none could define. The empire no longer had a face, only a system that continued out of inertia. Soldiers were bribed with gold, barbarians hired as allies, governors declared as rivals. Yet the marble statues remained, serene, expressionless, watching the decline unfold beneath their unblinking eyes. Rome's people had learned to live within instability. To them, the emperor was no longer a man, but an abstraction, a name on decrees, a profile on a coin. When one was killed, another appeared, like the next mask in an endless play. The madness that had once burned in individuals, in Caligula, Nero, Commodus, now diffused into the air, invisible and omnipresent. The empire itself had become the patient. Its symptoms were everywhere, in the temples, where priests performed rituals they no longer believed in the Senate, where eloquence replaced conviction, in the villas where mosaics glittered over empty rooms. The marble endured, but meaning did not. Even architecture reflected the malaise. Once Roman buildings were made to celebrate eternity, triumphal arches, domes and baths that defied time. Now new constructions were smaller, cheaper, and hastily built. The empire no longer created monuments to glory, it built shelters against collapse. Trade slowed, roads decayed, and the silver in coins thinned like watered wine. Each generation grew a little more uncertain of its inheritance. And yet, amid the weariness, there was still beauty. The Mediterranean shimmered as it always had. Poets wrote in exile, sculptors carved faces that still seemed alive. The empire was dying in the way that great civilizations die, not with thunder, but with sighs, with echoes, with the slow forgetting of what once made them unique. From the distant provinces, reports continued to arrive. Gothic raids on the Danube, Persian incursions in Mesopotamia, plague in the cities. But these were not yet disasters. They were signs, the slow tightening of the circle. Historians later described this period as one of transition, the last moment before Rome transformed from a republic of marble into a fortress of iron. But in the moment itself, it felt like quiet decay. The empire still glittered, but the glitter was the sheen of dust in sunlight. Philosophers began to write not of politics, but of endurance. To persist, one wrote, is now the only virtue. Stoicism, once the creed of emperors, became a form of survival. The gods, once thunderous, now whispered, and somewhere in that vast stillness, the idea of Rome began to change. It ceased to be a living city, and became a memory, an idea that sustained its own ruins. The madness of emperors had been spectacular, visible, human. The madness of empire was quieter, the refusal to see that decay had become its form of life. The empire still stood, the legions still marched, the Senate still convened, but all of it was shadow, a civilization that continued to breathe only because it had forgotten how to die. From the long dusk of the 3rd century, Rome did not rise again in glory, but in bureaucracy. Out of the silence that followed the years of collapse came a man of iron composure, not a dreamer or philosopher, but a soldier turned administrator. Diocletian. He was not born to rule. His beginnings were obscure, a provincial from Dalmatia, the son of a freed slave, a product of the army rather than the Senate. He had seen emperors rise and fall like waves against a seawall. When his own moment came, in 284 CE, he He brought not vision but precision. He ruled not through charisma, but through calculation. The empire he inherited was vast, frayed, and unrecognizable. It had become a patchwork of loyalties, its frontiers porous, its treasury hollow. Legions were scattered across endless borders, and famine gnawed at the countryside. Yet what frightened Diocletian most was not rebellion or invasion, it was entropy. The empire was decaying not through defeat, but through exhaustion, and so, to save Rome, he chose to dismantle it. He divided the world. In the year 293 CE, Diocletian created the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. No longer would one man bear the impossible weight of the entire empire. Instead, there would be two Augusti and two Caesars, senior and junior emperors, each governing their own sphere. Diocletian took the east. His trusted ally Maximian took the west. Beneath them, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus ruled as deputies and heirs. It was, for a time, an act of genius. Administration became religion. Laws multiplied like prayers, recorded on wax and stone, carried through corridors of clerks and scribes. Diocletian reorganized provinces, redrew borders, standardized taxation, and imposed price controls through the Edict on Maximum Prices. An immense document that sought to fix the economy through decree alone. Rome itself, the old heart of empire, lost its centrality. The emperors now ruled from new capitals closer to the borders: Nicomedia, Milan, Sirmium, and Trier. The empire ceased to be a city's dominion and became a network of fortresses, palaces, and administrative hubs, an organism of marble and parchment. For ordinary people, the empire became a distant abstraction. The emperor was no longer a man to be seen in the forum, but a sacred figure hidden behind ceremony. Diocletian took on the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and his court reflected this divine distance. Officials knelt before him. His purple robes shimmered like a curtain between mortality and power. The age of the citizen had ended. The age of subjects had begun. It was an empire of rituals, everything ordered, measured, codified. The army was restructured into frontier legions and mobile reserves. Cities were fortified, taxes were assessed down to the smallest plot of land, binding peasants to their soil, artisans to their trades, and soldiers to their posts. It was efficient, cold, and monumental, a machinery of survival. For a moment it worked. Grain flowed again. The borders stabilized, roads were repaired, and law returned to the provinces. Merchants traveled with cautious confidence under the imperial seal. And yet, beneath the smoothness of this restored order, something human had gone missing. The empire's calm was no longer the peace of confidence, but the stillness of control. Everything that could be counted was counted. Everything that could be ordered was ordered. The imperial cult returned in elaborate pageantry, incense processions, and the illusion that the divine order mirrored the bureaucratic one. The great persecution against the Christians, begun in 303 CE, revealed the limits of this system. For Diocletian, religion was part of order. To refuse the old gods was to reject the empire itself. Temples were restored, sacrifices made mandatory, churches burned. But even in his persecution, Diocletian's motives were administrative rather than emotional. He sought not faith, but uniformity. The empire was now a temple of efficiency. Its gods, the laws themselves. He built magnificent palaces, not in Rome, but on the edges of empire. His residence at Split, facing the Adriatic Sea, was part fortress, part villa, part mausoleum. Its walls still stand today, immense and silent, a geometry of stone reflecting his mind, vast, ordered, enclosed. Within its chambers, marble corridors lead to nowhere, stairways descend into darkness, and colonnades open toward the sea. It is the architecture of control, beautiful, distant, absolute. After 2 decades of rule, Diocletian did something no emperor before him had done. He abdicated. In 305 CE, weakened by illness, he stepped down voluntarily, retreating to his palace in Split to cultivate cabbages. Power had been his burden, not his passion. He watched from afar as his tetrarchy unraveled, alliances frayed, ambition returned, and the empire once again slid toward conflict. He lived long enough to see his carefully crafted system fail. When envoys came to him years later, asking that he return to restore order, he declined with quiet irony, saying that if they saw the vegetables he had grown, they would never ask such a thing. In that gesture, the ruler who became a gardener, lies the essence of Diocletian's reign. His empire had been one of symmetry and structure, not of feeling or faith. He had saved Rome by freezing it in place, turning it into a marble mask over a restless corpse. The empire survived him, but only as a divided organism. The east would soon grow into Byzantium, the west into fragility. His tetrarchy became a memory, his reforms a blueprint for survival and suffocation alike. Through his laws, Rome endured. Through his order, it ceased to live. The world he left behind was quiet, polished and haunted, a place where bureaucracy replaced belief, where every citizen had a place but few had purpose. In the stillness of his palace by the sea, Diocletian's marble corridors caught the sound of the waves. It was the empire breathing, slow, mechanical, endless, and in that sound, history turned once more toward darkness. In the long quiet that followed Diocletian's abdication, the empire seemed to drift between identities, half machine, half memory. His division of the world had preserved it, but the balance was fragile. The tetrarchy, meant to end ambition, only multiplied it. Each Augustus and Caesar became both partner and rival, bound by design, yet driven by the old Roman hunger for singular rule. Out of that fractured order rose Constantine, a name that would reshape not just the empire, but the idea of civilization itself. He was born in Naissus, in the Balkans, around 272 CE, the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of Diocletian's Caesars, and Helena, a woman of humble origin, whose quiet faith would one day echo through history. Raised amid camps and councils, Constantine was educated in both war and ceremony, learning to navigate the empire's labyrinth of loyalty and fear. When Diocletian retired and the tetrarchy began to unravel, Constantine was drawn into its slow implosion. He became emperor not through inheritance, but through survival, moving cautiously across the chessboard of power until, one by one, his rivals fell. The process was long, bloody, and relentless. By 324 CE, after years of civil wars, he stood alone as ruler of both East and West. The world had its single emperor again, but Constantine's empire was not Diocletian's. The marble had cracked, the divine hierarchy had failed. Power needed a new foundation, something less brittle than ritual, something deeper than decree. What Diocletian sought in order, Constantine sought in faith. The change did not come in a single moment, but history remembers one, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. Facing his rival Maxentius outside Rome, Constantine was said to have seen a sign in the sky, a cross of light above the sun, and the words in hoc signo vinces, in this sign, conquer. That night, he ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the symbol of the Chi, the intertwined Greek letters of Christ's name. The next day, Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome as victor. It was not the first time an emperor claimed divine favor, but it was the first time the divine had come from beyond Rome's old pantheon. The transformation that followed was quiet but absolute. Constantine did not abolish the old gods, not yet, but their temples grew silent. In their place, new buildings began to rise, basilicas rather than temples, crosses rather than eagles. He issued the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, granting tolerance to Christians after centuries of persecution. It was not just mercy, it was strategy. Christianity, once a persecuted sect of artisans and slaves, offered what the old order had lost, unity. It spoke not to class or province, but to souls. It offered the emperor a new kind of legitimacy, not divine descent, but divine selection. And so the machinery of empire began to hum again. this time powered by belief rather than bureaucracy. Constantine's rule became a paradox of faith and authority. He surrounded himself with bishops and theologians, yet he retained the habits of absolute power. He presided over the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, a gathering of church leaders meant to define Christian doctrine, as if it were another senate. The question before them was theological, the nature of Christ's divinity, yet beneath it pulsed the same Roman instinct, the need to make order from dispute, to unify through decree. From that council emerged the Nicene Creed, the statement of belief still recited by millions centuries later. But it also marked the birth of something else, the fusion of empire and faith. Rome, which once worshipped its emperors, now served a god who crowned them. Constantine's transformation of power was not spiritual in the sense of surrender, but architectural. He built his faith into stone. The Arch of Constantine, still standing near the Colosseum, celebrates his victory not through Christian imagery, but through the language of triumph inherited from pagan Rome, a careful bridge between worlds. More decisive still was his founding of a new capital, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Built on the site of ancient Byzantium, it stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, a city of walls and domes, marble and light. He called it Nova Roma, the New Rome, but it was something else entirely, a city turned inward, where faith would outlast empire. In Constantinople, Constantine became something different from a Roman emperor. He became a symbol, not of conquest, but of divine purpose. He minted coins with the image of Christ beside his own, and decreed Sunday a day of rest. He supported the church, yet delayed baptism until his deathbed, as if keeping one foot in the world of power and another in the promise of redemption. His was not the madness of Nero or Caligula, not a fevered delusion of divinity, but a quieter form of self-deification, where they declared themselves gods. Constantine believed himself chosen by one, and in that subtle shift, the Roman world changed forever. The marble temples that once echoed with the names of Jupiter and Mars began to crumble or transform. The basilicas of the new faith rose, filled with candlelight and chanting, a different kind of theatre, slower and more solemn. The empire's imagery softened. Eagles gave way to doves, triumphal processions to pilgrimages, sacrifice to prayer. Yet the hierarchy remained. The emperor was still supreme, now not as deity, but as instrument. The empire had found a new mask. To later generations, Constantine would be remembered as the Great, a man who brought light into the ruins of a weary world. Yet the light he brought also cast new shadows. Infusing faith with power, he created an empire that could no longer separate the two. The old madness, the divine delusion of emperors, had not vanished. It had simply changed form. Under Constantine, divinity no longer belonged to the man, but to the system. The empire itself became sanctified, its victories, its decrees, its survival framed as providence. What had once been madness now wore the calm face of faith, and so in the quiet glow of candlelight reflecting on marble, the Roman world entered its final transformation, no longer pagan, no longer purely human, but something suspended between heaven and earth. The gods had changed, the power had not. When Constantine died in 337 CE, the world he left behind was already divided, not by sword or frontier, but by inheritance. His sons, bound by ambition more than blood, turned his unity into a chessboard. Civil wars flickered across the empire, like candles burning too low, each victory brief, each peace fragile. Yet out of the confusion, one half of the empire began to define itself not by conquest, but by endurance. It would come to be known not as Rome, but as Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, born of survival and ceremony. Its capital, Constantinople, shimmered like a dream at the meeting of continents. Its walls, triple-layered and immense, faced both the Bosporus and the centuries ahead. From the air, had there been eyes to see from above, the city might have seemed eternal, a crown of domes, spires and marble, held aloft between sea and sky. Inside its palaces, everything moved with ritual precision. Time itself seemed slowed by incense and chant. Eunuchs glided through corridors, priests whispered beneath mosaics, and emperors, now draped not in armor but in silk, ruled through ceremony more than command. The empire's madness no longer burned in blood, it murmured in theology. The Byzantines saw themselves not as heirs to Rome, but as Rome itself, purified and eternal. Latin faded from the tongue of governance, Greek returned, law was recodified under Justinian, whose corpus juris civilis, the code of civil law, would echo through millennia. Churches rose, most famously, the Hagia Sophia, where the divine was no longer represented, but architecturally embodied. To stand beneath its dome was to feel the empire's new soul, a geometry of faith, a harmony of stone and light. But the perfection of order is always an illusion. Beneath the liturgies and the icons, Byzantium trembled with subtler forms of unrest. Heresy became its new rebellion, no longer against emperors, but against ideas. Councils met to define what could be believed, the dual nature of Christ, the veneration of images, the boundaries of salvation. And as emperors once murdered rivals for thrones, they now exiled bishops for words. Madness had not left Rome, it had changed its costume. One could feel it in the quiet obsession of Justinian's reign, his drive to restore the western provinces, his endless wars against the Goths, Vandals and Persians, his rebuilding of the capital after the Nika riots left tens of thousands dead. He sought to remake the world, but the world no longer wished to be remade. When plague swept through the empire in 541 CE, it was said that corpses filled the harbors and streets, the sea itself refusing to carry away so much death. Justinian lived through it though changed, an emperor haunted by the shadow of divine wrath. His wife, Theodora, once an actress, ruled beside him with steel in her calm. Their court became a place where sanctity and calculation intertwined, the emperor as God's vicegerent, the empress as moral arbiter, both encased in the stillness of ceremony. And when they died, the empire continued exactly as before, smooth, orderly, devout. Byzantium had perfected the art of continuity. It did not fall into chaos when emperors died. It simply absorbed them, as if the palace walls themselves had learned how to rule. The centuries that followed were slower, almost meditative. Icons replaced idols, gold mosaics replaced frescoes, monks copied texts in candlelight, saving knowledge that the West had forgotten. The empire's heartbeat grew faint but regular, a civilization suspended between memory and devotion, yet the quiet had weight. In this long dusk, the emperor was both more and less than human. He was the chosen of God, anointed and crowned in the vast echoing space of Hagia Sophia, where choirs sang hymns that merged heaven with empire. But behind the robes and the reverence, he was a prisoner of ritual. Each gesture, each word, each procession was prescribed. To rule was to perform. The palace at Blakeney became the empire's theatre of eternity. Within its halls, time seemed to circle rather than progress. Courtiers debated doctrine, while the frontiers shrank. Envoys bowed before emperors whose armies no longer conquered but endured. Diplomacy replaced expansion, tribute replaced tribute, and the empire's strength became its ability to survive by adaptation. It was not the power of a lion, but of stone, patient still and worn smooth by centuries of weather. Outside the city walls, however, the world kept changing. The Western Empire had fallen to barbarian kingdoms. Rome itself lay in fragments, its columns overgrown, its forums silent. New faiths rose beyond Byzantium's reach, Islam in the deserts, Frankish Christendom in the forests of Gaul. The Byzantines watched them all with a kind of serene disdain, convinced that theirs was the only true civilization, and in a way, they were right. For 1,000 years after the West had fallen, Constantinople stood, a beacon of learning, law, and liturgy. its libraries full, its palaces intact. But the cost of such endurance was rigidity. Every age that lasts too long becomes a monument to its own caution. The empire that had once been a forge of ideas now became a reliquary, preserving, polishing, and protecting the past. Innovation gave way to imitation, curiosity to theology. Madness in Byzantium did not wear the face of chaos, it hid behind sanctity. Emperors saw omens in eclipses, sought guidance in relics, and believed their crowns were defended by angels. In mosaics they appeared side by side with Christ, miniature eternities embedded in glass. Power had finally merged with divinity completely. And so the empire continued, luminous but immobile, a flame that refused to flicker or fade. It would endure sieges, invasions, and centuries of isolation, its light gradually dimming, its grandeur turning inward. The shadows grew longer, stretching from its golden domes toward the horizon. The world beyond moved faster, but Byzantium remained itself, serene, tired, unbroken. In the quiet glow of its churches, amid the slow rhythm of chant and incense, the last echo of Rome lingered. The marble was still beautiful, the faith was still strong, but the world had moved on. The empire's survival had become its final illusion. The light that lingered upon Byzantium's domes eventually dimmed, and with it, the long voice of Rome faded into the murmur of history. The city that had once outlasted centuries fell not in fury, but in exhaustion. When the Ottoman banners finally rose above Constantinople in 1453, there was no roar from the gods, no thunder from heaven, only the slow echo of footsteps in marble halls that had forgotten their purpose. The empire that began with Augustus had finally come to rest. In the west, Rome had long since dissolved into ruin. Its forums were grazing fields, its amphitheatres hollowed by time and scavengers. Columns leaned into the earth, arches framed nothing but silence. Grass grew where senators once debated, and the wind moved through broken vaults where emperors once stood enthroned. The silence was not absence, it was presence, a dense, living quiet, as though the stones themselves were remembering. Through centuries, pilgrims and poets came to wander among the ruins. They found no armies, no law, no fire, but something else, a sense of vastness that had survived its own meaning. Cicadas chirped where trumpets once blared. The Tiber flowed indifferently past the relics of marble gods and toppled columns, reflecting a sky unchanged since the days of Augustus. In that silence one could almost hear the ghosts of power, not as spirits but as impressions, traces of human grandeur carved into the air. The madness that had once burned in Caligula's eyes, the cold suspicion of Tiberius, the strange beauty of Hadrian's architecture, the gold shimmer of Byzantium's liturgies, all of it drifted now in the dust motes above the ruins. The emperors had achieved what they sought most to be remembered, but they could not control what they would become within that memory. For memory, like empire, is its own form of distortion. The chroniclers wrote of them with awe and fear, blending fact with legend. Caligula became the archetype of cruelty, Nero the emblem of excess. Even the good emperors were rewritten by time. Augustus transformed into a demigod of order, Hadrian into a philosopher, Constantine into a saint. The truth of their minds, their small gestures, their sleepless nights, all dissolved into myth, and yet something of the human remained. It lingered in the faint outlines of frescoes, in the worn steps of palaces where sandals once shuffled, in the fragments of letters and decrees that scholars would later unearth. These remnants spoke not of glory, but of fragility. They whispered that the empire had been, above all, an attempt, a vast, flawed experiment in holding chaos still. But chaos never disappears, it only changes form. After the empire's fall, Europe inherited its ghosts. Kings took up the eagle and the laurel, calling themselves holy or Roman or imperial. They built new capitals upon old foundations, raised new statues over forgotten ones. The world continued, but always with Rome's reflection glimmering faintly beneath its surface, a buried mirror. The ruins became classrooms. The marble that once bore commands now taught humility. Artists sketched fallen arches, philosophers pondered impermanence, and monks copied the histories of those long-dead emperors in ink that outlived their blood. The madness of Rome became a lesson in measure, its grandeur, a warning cloaked in admiration. Over time, moss softened the outlines of the Forum. Dust settled inside the Colosseum's corridors. The aqueducts stood like bones of something ancient and once living, now skeletal against the sun. Travelers wrote of Rome as if it were a dream, a place both present and gone, heavy with time, and beneath it all, silence remained the empire's truest legacy. It was not the silence of erasure, but of endurance, the kind that follows great storms, the world still but changed. The madness that had once animated emperors now belonged to history itself, an endless fascination, a quiet curiosity for what power does to those who hold it too long. The ruins of Rome are not mournful, they are contemplative. In their shadows the ambitions of centuries seem almost gentle, the desire to be eternal reduced to patterns of light and stone. The arches catch the sun as they always did. The wind moves softly through the pillars, carrying fragments of Latin prayers and imperial decrees as indistinguishable whispers. Somewhere far beneath layers of soil and centuries lie the bones of emperors, indistinguishable from the citizens they once ruled. Marble tombs cracked, inscriptions worn away, all distinctions blurred. In death they achieved the equality their reigns had denied. And yet, as night falls over the old city, there is still a strange beauty. The same moon that watched Nero's torches now rises above broken temples. The same stars that glittered over Augustus's Rome now shimmer through the arches of the Colosseum. Time has carried everything away except the feeling that something immense once stood here. Power has become memory. Memory has become silence. And in that silence the echo of madness finally fades. The story of Rome ends not in tragedy but in stillness, a vast, calm acceptance. The empire in its rise and fall becomes a reflection of the human condition itself, the longing for control, the fear of decay, the endless reaching toward permanence. In the end, the empire succeeded not by surviving but by being remembered. The marble of its cities, the dust of its ruins, the words of its chroniclers, all continue to speak in the same quiet tone that nothing lasts and nothing truly dies. The emperors are gone, the madness has subsided. Only the silence remains, deep, unbroken, eternal.